My name is Elena Marsh. I am 34 years old, and at 8:47 on a Saturday evening, wearing a black dress that cost $41 from a clearance rack, I watched my mother-in-law point a manicured finger at my face in front of 11 members of the Whitfield family and call me trash, right there at the head of a mahogany table that alone was worth more than my father's entire pickup truck. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I picked up the gravy boat, walked around the table, and finished serving dinner, because I already knew something none of them did. In 14 days, every single person laughing at that table was going to lose everything, and I was the one holding the match. If you are watching this from your own kitchen tonight, maybe reheating something in a pan that's seen better days while somebody in your life makes you feel small, comment the city you're watching from, hit like, and subscribe, because what happened next is the kind of quiet, surgical revenge that people don't believe is real until they've lived it. 3 things were happening in my life at once that summer, and none of them had a whisper of a starting point that anyone at that dinner table could see. The first was money, a very specific, very ugly kind of money. 11 months earlier, as a forensic accountant with a specialty in trust and estate fraud, I had noticed a $2,000 discrepancy in a routine reconciliation of my own household accounts, the kind of discrepancy any other wife might blame on a forgotten Target run. I did not blame it on a Target run. I opened a spreadsheet. That $2,000 became $6,000 by March, then $19,000 by June, then, by the night of that dinner, $218,000 had moved out of accounts that were supposed to be untouchable, the Whitfield Family Legacy Trust, established by my father-in-law Harold Whitfield in 1994 with an initial $4 million, meant to fund his grandchildren's education and, eventually, mine and my husband's retirement. Someone had been bleeding it dry through 11 wire transfers disguised as consulting fees to a shell company called Meridian Advisory Partners LLC, a company that, according to the Delaware Secretary of State's public filing database, had been registered exactly 6 days after my husband's 36th birthday. That was Loop A, and it had a name attached to it that made my stomach turn every time I typed it into a search bar at 11 at night, while Derek slept 8 feet away, snoring, utterly unaware his wife could see straight through him. The second thing was a photograph. Not a dramatic one, no hotel keycard, no lipstick on a collar, nothing so cinematic. Just a photograph on a phone I wasn't supposed to be holding, of my husband Derek Whitfield, 36 years old, standing on a dock in Sausalito, with his arm around a woman I recognized instantly because she had been at our wedding, seated at table 6, laughing a little too loudly during my father's toast. Her name was Brooke Calloway, 31, my sister-in-law Vanessa's closest friend since college, a woman who had hugged me at my own baby shower 15 months earlier and told me I looked glowing. The photo was time-stamped 6:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Derek had told me he was stuck at the office doing quarterly projections. I had not confronted him. I had, instead, done what I do for a living. I built a timeline. That was Loop B, and it would take me 4 more months to understand just how many people in that family had known and said nothing. The third thing was harder to name, because it wasn't a fact, it was a decision, made slowly, the way ice forms on a lake. You don't notice the exact moment it becomes solid enough to hold weight. I decided I was not going to cry in front of these people. I was not going to file for divorce quietly and slink away with whatever scraps a mediator negotiated for me. I decided, somewhere around the time I found the third fraudulent wire transfer, that if Derek Whitfield and his mother Patricia wanted to treat me like something they'd scraped off the bottom of a $500 shoe, I was going to make absolutely sure that the day they finally understood who I was, it happened somewhere they could never hide from it, in front of every single witness who had ever watched them condescend to me. That was Loop C, and the plan I built to get there started with a locked drawer in my home office, a burner email address, and a phone call to a woman named Renata O.C., my father's oldest friend, and, as it happened, one of the most feared forensic litigation attorneys in the state of Illinois. To understand how I ended up serving gravy to people who despised me, you have to understand how I met Derek Whitfield in the first place, because the story the family told at parties was never the story that actually happened. The version Patricia liked to tell, usually while topping off her second glass of Sancerre, was that her brilliant son had discovered me at a charity gala, plucked from obscurity like some Cinderella with a calculator. The real version is that I met Derek at a networking mixer in Chicago's West Loop in September, 6 years before that dinner, when I was 28 and 3 years into building a reputation at Harrow & Voss. a boutique forensic accounting firm that specialized in untangling exactly the kind of fraud I would later find inside my own marriage. Derek was standing near the bar in a suit that fit too well for someone who, I would later learn, was 3 payments behind on it, telling a small circle of admirers about a family office he ran that managed, in his words, north of 30 million in discretionary assets. I found out 18 months into our marriage that the family office was, in practice, Derek forwarding his father Harold's actual investment decisions to a handful of relatives and taking a 2% advisory fee for the privilege of doing nothing. Harold Whitfield, my father-in-law, was 71 years old, a self-made man who had built Whitfield Structural Group, a commercial construction and engineering firm, from a single crew of 11 men in 1979 into a company that, by the time I married into the family, employed over 600 people and had annual revenue north of $80 million. Harold was quiet in the particular way that powerful men are often quiet. He let the room fill with noise and simply watched who filled it. He wore the same 3 Navy suits in rotation, drove a 12-year-old Buick when he could have driven anything he wanted, and had a habit of remembering the names of every single person who worked for him, down to the newest apprentice electrician. I liked Harold from the very first Thanksgiving. I did not understand yet how much that would matter. Patricia Whitfield, Harold's wife, was a different animal entirely. Patricia had grown up genuinely wealthy, old Lake Forest money, 3 generations of it, though most of that money had quietly evaporated by the time she married Harold in 1976, a fact she spent the rest of her life aggressively pretending was not true. Patricia's defining trait, the one she performed at every single family gathering without fail, was a kind of weaponized arrogance dressed up as manners. She corrected people's grammar at the dinner table. She asked visitors, within the first 10 minutes of meeting them, where they had summered as children, and then visibly recalibrated her interest in them based on the answer. The first time I met her, at that same fateful Thanksgiving, she asked me what my father did for a living, and when I told her he was a union electrician in Rockford, she said, without missing a beat, "Well, isn't that useful?" and then turned to ask Derek's sister about her Pilates instructor. I remember standing in that kitchen with a serving spoon in my hand and understanding, immediately and completely, that Patricia Whitfield had already decided everything she needed to know about me, and no accomplishment I could produce would ever be enough to change her mind. I was right. 6 years, 1 wedding, 1 miscarriage I never told her about, and 1 CPA license with a forensic specialization later, I was still, in Patricia's eyes, the accountant Derek married, said in the exact tone someone might use for the raccoon that got into the garage. Vanessa Whitfield Pruitt, 38, Derek's older sister, had exactly one personality trait she deployed with total consistency: entitlement, sharpened to a fine, glittering edge. Vanessa had never worked a paying job in her life that lasted longer than 8 months, had been divorced twice by the age of 36, each time walking away with a settlement that made the marriage look, in retrospect, like a business transaction with better catering, and lived in a 5-bedroom house in Winnetka that her parents had quietly co-signed on, a fact she referred to, when it came up at all, as the house Marcus left me, despite the fact that Marcus, her second husband, had contributed almost nothing to the down payment. Vanessa's specific talent was making other people's success feel like theft from her personal inheritance. When I made partner track at Harrow and Voss 2 years into my marriage, Vanessa's first words to me were, "Must be nice to have a job that doesn't require you to be good at people." When my forensic report on a manufacturing fraud case made regional business news, she posted a single black and white photo of herself at a spa that same afternoon with the caption, "Some of us prioritize peace." I stopped expecting warmth from Vanessa around year 2. I started, quietly, keeping a folder. Chip Whitfield. His real name was Charles, but nobody, including his own father, had called him that since roughly 1998, was 33, Derek's younger brother, and possessed exactly one trait deployed with even more consistency than Vanessa's entitlement: an almost artistic commitment to doing as little as humanly possible while still being fed, housed, and financed by people who loved him more than he had ever earned. Chip had started 4 different businesses in the time I knew him: a cold brew coffee subscription service, a men's grooming line, a real estate flipping venture that flipped exactly 0 properties, and, most recently, something he described as a content optimization agency that appeared to consist of Chip posting motivational quotes over stock photography of mountains. Each venture had been seeded with money from Harold, each had failed within a year, and each failure had been narrated by Chip, without apparent irony, as evidence that he was simply too far ahead of the market. Chip lived rent-free in the guest house behind his parents' Lake Forest estate, a guest house nicer than the first apartment I'd rented out of college, and referred to this arrangement as between chapters. And then there was Derek, my husband. 36 years old when that dinner happened, the kind of handsome that photographs beautifully and wears thin in person over the course of about 4 years. A man who had built an entire adult identity on being Harold Whitfield's son, without ever once demonstrating he could survive as anything else. Derek's job title, printed on cream cardstock business cards he'd had made at a print shop in Deerfield, read Managing Director, Whitfield Capital Advisory, a company that existed almost entirely on paper, that had, as far as I could ever verify in 6 years of marriage, exactly 2 actual clients, both of them relatives who had been guilt-tripped into letting Derek manage a little something. Derek's real income, the number that would have appeared on an honest tax return, was somewhere around $41,000 a year. Derek's real spending, the number I eventually reconstructed line by line from 31 months of credit card statements he thought I'd never see because we kept separate accounts for independence, averaged closer to $14,000 a month. The difference between those two numbers is not a mystery. The difference between those two numbers is a crime, and by the time I finished mapping it, I understood exactly where the missing money had gone. Into a trust that was never his to touch, into a woman who was never supposed to be in that photograph, and into a version of himself he had been performing so consistently, for so long, that I genuinely believe some nights he forgot it wasn't real. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I told myself the imbalance was normal, that every family has a golden child dynamic, that Patricia's coldness was just an old money reflex and not something personal, that Derek's vagueness about money was a privacy preference and not a warning sign. I built my career quietly during those years, moving from senior associate to principal at Harrow & Voss, taking on cases that involved untangling exactly the kind of family-run financial deception I would later find in my own living room. A construction company skimming payroll, a family trust drained by a nephew with a gambling problem, a widow whose late husband's business partner had been quietly siphoning funds for a decade before anyone noticed. I got very, very good at noticing. That is, ultimately, the tragedy and the gift of my profession. I was trained, professionally and repeatedly, to spot exactly the pattern that was living under my own roof, and it still took me 3 full years to let myself see it. Because seeing it meant admitting that the family who called themselves mine had never actually considered me one of them, and the man who was supposed to be my partner had built half his adult life out of lies so casual he probably didn't think of them as lies at all, just as management. The investigation started, as most of my professional investigations start, with a number that refused to explain itself. It was a Tuesday in February, and I was reconciling our joint household account against the Whitfield Family Legacy Trust's quarterly distribution statement, a task I did every quarter almost out of habit, because Harold, in a rare moment of vulnerability 2 years earlier, had asked me privately to keep an eye on things for him, since his own accountant, a semi-retired man named Gerald Voss, no relation to my firm, was, in Harold's words, getting a little slow. I found a distribution of $2,140, marked as a trustee administrative disbursement, to an entity called Meridian Advisory Partners, LLC. I had never heard of Meridian Advisory Partners. Trust administrative disbursements, in my professional experience, do not go to LLCs with names that sound like they were generated specifically to sound legitimate to someone not looking too closely. I did what I would have done for any client. I pulled the Delaware Secretary of State's Public Business Entity Search and found that Meridian Advisory Partners, LLC, had been registered on March the 9th, 6 days after Derek's 36th birthday, with a registered agent address that traced back to a mail forwarding service on North Wells Street in Chicago. The kind of address you rent for $99 a month, specifically because it makes a shell company look like it has an office. The listed manager on the formation documents was a name I did not recognize at first, R. Callahan. It took me 11 minutes of searching state licensing databases to find that Callahan was Ryan Callahan, a 34-year-old former classmate of Derek's from Northwestern, who now worked, according to his LinkedIn profile, as a freelance business consultant, a title so vague it might as well have said, does whatever Derek asks and doesn't ask questions. I did not confront anyone. I opened a spreadsheet instead, the same instinct that had built my entire career, and I labeled the tab Meridian Reconciliation. Over the following 6 weeks, working mostly between 11 p.m. and 1 in the morning after Derek had fallen asleep, sometimes sitting on the closed lid of the toilet in our master bathroom because it was the one room with a door that locked. I pulled every trust distribution statement I could access going back 3 years, cross-referenced them against the trust's official bank records, which, as a listed contingent beneficiary, I had limited but real access to through the trust's online portal, and built a full ledger. What I found was worse than a single embezzlement. It was a pattern, disciplined and patient, the kind of fraud that only works because the person committing it understands, intimately, exactly how much scrutiny a family is willing to apply to one of its own. 11 separate administrative disbursements to Meridian Advisory Partners LLC, ranging from $1,800 to $31,000, totaling $218,400 over 31 months. Each one had been authorized using Gerald Voss's trustee signature, a signature that, when I finally got my hands on a comparison sample from an old estate document Harold had once given me for a different reconciliation task, did not match. Not close. The forged signature was rounder, the capital G looped differently, the kind of discrepancy that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to look at signatures for a living, but glaring to someone who was. I photographed both signatures side by side and stored the image in a folder on an external hard drive I kept in a locked filing cabinet at my actual office, not at home, because by that point I no longer trusted that anything inside our house was truly private. I needed to know where the money went after it left Meridian. This part took longer because Meridian's own banking records weren't something I had legal access to, not yet, so I had to work backward from what I could see: Derek's spending. I pulled 31 months of statements from 4 different credit cards, 2 of which I did not even know existed until I found a Chase Sapphire Reserve bill folded inside a suit jacket pocket while doing laundry, a bill addressed to Derek at a P.O. box in Lake Forest instead of our home address, which told me everything about how deliberate this had become. Cross-referencing dates, I found a rhythm. Roughly 10 days after each Meridian disbursement hit whatever account absorbed it, a cluster of charges would appear. A $9,000 charge at a private membership club called the Averly Room, $4,100 at a boutique on Oak Street called Fenn & Rowe, that I would later learn sold, almost exclusively, women's jewelry, and, 6 separate times over those 31 months, charges from a company called Bayview Charters totaling $19,200, which I initially assumed was some kind of yacht rental for client entertainment, until I looked closer and found that every single Bayview Charters booking was for a 2-person weekend package out of a marina in Sausalito, California, a city Derek had visited, according to his own calendar, 6 times in 31 months, each trip logged as West Coast Investor Outreach. I sat with that discovery for 4 days before I let myself connect it to the photograph, because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted an innocent explanation for a man traveling 6 times to the same marina in another state to charter romantic weekend boat trips. There wasn't one. There never is when you actually do the math instead of hoping the math is wrong. Once I had the financial skeleton mapped, I needed something no spreadsheet could give me. Proof of intent, proof that this wasn't some innocent misunderstanding I could still, somehow, forgive my way out of. That's when I called Renata Osei. Renata had been my father's closest friend since they were both 23 years old working the same union hall in Rockford. Renata went to law school at night while working days as a paralegal, put herself through it on nothing but stubbornness, and by the time I called her that April, she was a named partner at Osei Renwick LLP, a litigation firm with a reputation so ruthless that opposing counsel in Chicago reportedly kept a group chat just to warn each other when her name showed up on a filing. Renata had held me as a baby. Renata had also, professionally, taken apart 3 separate multi-million-dollar family trust frauds in the last decade alone, including one case, still cited in continuing legal education seminars, where she'd used forensic handwriting analysis, combined with metadata from a forged notarization, to send a man's own brother to federal prison for 11 years. I met Renata at her office on a Thursday evening in May, told her everything, laid the external hard drive on her desk like evidence at a trial, because in my mind, by then, it was. Renata went quiet for a long moment after reviewing the signature comparison, then looked at me and said the sentence that changed the entire shape of my plan. Elena, this isn't just a bad marriage. This is federal wire fraud, and depending on what's actually in that LLC's operating agreement, it might also be elder financial exploitation. Because Gerald Voss is 78 years old, and I would bet my license his signature was lifted from an old document, not freshly forged with his knowledge. She told me what I needed to build before I could bring this to Harold, to law enforcement, or to anyone. Authenticated bank records subpoenaed properly, not screenshotted from a portal. A forensic document examiner's formal signature analysis, not my own trained eye. And, critically, Gerald Voss's own testimony, because if Gerald was innocent, used without his knowledge, he would become my most powerful witness, and if Gerald was complicit, that changed everything about how dangerous this actually was. It took 4 more months to build that case properly, months during which I kept showing up to Sunday dinners at the Lake Forest estate, kept enduring Patricia's comments about my little job downtown, kept watching Chip mooch off his father's checking account while Derek quietly drained the trust that was supposed to protect all of us, kept smiling at Vanessa's carefully engineered cruelty and kept saying nothing, because the moment I said something, the moment any of them knew I was looking, Derek would have every reason in the world to destroy the paper trail, move the money somewhere I couldn't follow it, and disappear the evidence that would otherwise send him, and possibly his mother, into a courtroom. While Renata worked in the background pulling together a proper evidentiary chain, my life above the surface had to look completely unchanged, which meant enduring Patricia, Vanessa, and Chip in their natural habitats, over and over, while carrying $218,000 of forensic knowledge behind my eyes like a stone I couldn't put down. The first real test came at Patricia's 63rd birthday dinner, held at Les Bernardines' Chicago outpost in a private room that cost, I would later learn from the receipt Derek left in the car, $4,700 for 14 people, a bill split, as always, in a way that ensured Harold quietly covered the difference no matter what anyone else claimed to contribute. Patricia arrived in a cream Chanel suit, air-kissed her way around the table, and when she reached me, looked me up and down with the specific, practiced slowness of a woman inventorying a stranger's outfit for flaws, and said, "Elena, that color is brave on you," which, translated from Patricia, meant the exact opposite of a compliment. Later that evening, when the topic of the upcoming Whitfield Structural Group 40th Anniversary Gala came up, a black tie event Harold was planning for September at the Drake Hotel to celebrate 4 decades of the company he'd built, Patricia turned to me with a smile so thin it barely qualified as one and said, "You'll come, of course, though I imagine you'll want to keep to the edges of the room. Dear, it's mostly clients and old family friends." I smiled back and said I'd be delighted to attend, and inside my head I was already doing arithmetic about guest lists, press coverage, and exactly how many witnesses that gala would put in one room. The second time Patricia's arrogance sharpened into something I filed away specifically, it happened 3 weeks later, at a smaller Sunday dinner, when she was discussing a friend's daughter who had married beneath her, Patricia's actual phrase, delivered without a flicker of self-awareness while sitting directly across from me, and then pivoted, apparently for sport, to ask how my little forensic hobby was going, as though I spent my days doing crossword puzzles rather than testifying as an expert witness in federal civil fraud cases. I told her, evenly, that I'd recently closed a case involving $11 million in embezzled construction payroll funds, expecting, perhaps foolishly, a flicker of interest. Patricia's response was to ask Vanessa, without missing a beat, whether the caterer for the gala had confirmed the raw bar. I remember setting down my fork very carefully that night, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself not to throw. Vanessa's entitlement got its own showcase a month after that, at what was supposed to be a casual lunch at her house in Winnetka, ostensibly to plan baby shower details for a cousin, though Vanessa spent most of the 2 hours talking about her upcoming trip to Positano, a trip she described in detail, the villa, the private chef, the just a small group, 12 of us, before turning to me and asking, apropos of nothing, whether Derek and I had figured out whether we could contribute toward the group villa cost, since, and I quote her exactly because I wrote it down in the car afterward, "Everyone's supposed to chip in based on what they can afford, and obviously that's relative." I told her we'd have to check our budget. Vanessa's face did something complicated, somewhere between disappointment and contempt, and she said, "Right, of course. Must be tight with just Derek's consulting thing." A sentence that would have been merely condescending if I hadn't already known, by then, exactly how much of Derek's consulting thing was funded by money he was stealing from his own father. The second Vanessa moment came in August, closer to the gala, when Vanessa, who had never once, in 6 years, asked me a single question about my actual work, cornered me in Patricia's kitchen while helping arrange charcuterie boards and asked, in a voice pitched for an audience of exactly the 2 of us, whether it was true that Derek and I were having money problems because she'd heard things. I asked her what things, genuinely curious what version of the truth had reached her. Vanessa smiled the particular Whitfield smile, the one that shows exactly enough teeth to look friendly from across a room, and said, "Oh, just that you two seem tense lately. I just think it's important families are honest with each other, don't you?" I agreed that honesty within families was very important, and I meant it more sincerely than she understood, because I was 3 weeks away from being more honest with this family than any of them were prepared for. Chip's laziness required less patience and more raw endurance, mostly because Chip's failures were financial in a way that directly touched the same trust Derek was draining, which meant every anecdote about Chip's newest venture landed on me like a small, additional betrayal. At a 4th of July barbecue at the Lake Forest Estate, Chip cornered me by the pool, beer in hand, to pitch me. Unprompted, and despite the fact I had never once expressed interest in his business ventures, on his latest idea, a subscription box for curated masculinity content, which, when I asked him to clarify, turned out to mean a monthly box of protein bars and a laminated card with a quote from a podcast. Chip asked if I thought Harold would be open to seeding the idea with $15,000 in starting capital, and when I asked, carefully neutral, whether he'd considered getting a job in the meantime to build some independent capital of his own, Chip laughed like I'd made a joke and said, "Elena, come on, that's not really my lane," and then wandered off to refill his drink, leaving me standing there with the specific, exhausting knowledge that this man had never once, in his adult life, had to seriously consider the question of whether money simply existed for him. The second Chip incident happened at that same barbecue, later, when Harold, visibly tired in the quiet way he got tired, not dramatic, just a slight slump in the shoulders, mentioned, almost offhand, that Whitfield Structural Group had a junior project coordinator role opening up. Entry level, good benefits, a real foot in the door for anyone willing to learn the business from the ground up, the way Harold himself had. Chip, standing right there, said, "Yeah, maybe, if the timing works with my content stuff," and then immediately changed the subject to ask whether the pool guy could come earlier next week because the current time slot was kind of a vibe kill for his afternoon. I watched Harold's face very carefully in that moment. I watched him absorb, for what was clearly not the first time, that his younger son had no intention of ever building anything real, and I filed that look away too, because it told me something important. Harold Whitfield was tired of being disappointed by people who took his generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift, and tired people, eventually, become willing to see the truth, even when the truth is ugly. Derek, through all of this, moved through the family with the ease of someone who had never once had to earn the space he took up. He told the story of closing a big client at dinners where, as far as I could ever verify, no such client existed. He made a habit of ordering the most expensive bottle on any restaurant's wine list and then subtly angling the check toward Harold at the end of the night with a practiced, "Dad, you've got this one, right? I'll get the next one." A promise that, over 6 years, I never once saw him keep. He kissed my forehead in front of his mother with a tenderness that never once made it home with us in private, a performance so consistent I sometimes wondered if he'd forgotten which version of himself was real. And through it all, every single interaction, I smiled, I served the gravy, I helped clear the plates, I complimented Patricia's centerpieces, and I built my case. Quietly, patiently, the way you build anything that has to hold weight later. One verified fact at a time. Renata's office moved on a parallel track that summer, and every update she gave me landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into implications I hadn't fully considered. The first real breakthrough came when Renata arranged, through a colleague who specialized in elder law, a quiet, informal conversation with Gerald Voss himself. Not a deposition, not yet, just a conversation, framed to Gerald as a routine trust administration review, the kind of thing his firm did periodically. Gerald was 78, sharp in the way careful old men often are even when their hands have started to shake, and when Renata's colleague slid the 2 signature samples across the table, the authentic Voss signature from an old estate document, and the signature on the Meridian disbursement authorizations, Gerald went pale, put on his reading glasses, took them off, put them back on, and said quietly, "I did not sign this." He explained that 18 months earlier, Derek had visited his office under the guise of a routine beneficiary check-in, a courtesy visit Derek had made exactly once before in 6 years, and had asked to review a stack of old, already executed distribution forms for his own records. Forms that included several blank authorization pages Gerald kept on file for minor recurring administrative transfers under $500. Gerald, trusting, had let Derek take copies. Somewhere in that stack of copies, someone had lifted Gerald's actual signature, digitally isolated it, and pasted it onto new authorization documents for transfers that had never once crossed Gerald's actual desk. Gerald was not complicit. Gerald was a victim, an unwitting one, and the moment Renata confirmed that, the entire shape of the case shifted, because now there was a second victim in this story who had every legal incentive to cooperate fully, and a forged signature crime with a clear, identifiable method, rather than a murky, he said, she said about family money. The second breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Ryan Callahan himself, Derek's old Northwestern classmate and the listed manager of Meridian Advisory Partners, LLC. Renata's investigator, a soft-spoken former IRS criminal investigation agent named Marcus Feld, who now ran his own consultancy, spent 3 weeks quietly reconstructing Ryan's financial life, and discovered that Ryan, despite being the manager of an LLC that had processed over $200,000, had a personal net worth that could most charitably be described as modest. A leased Audi, $41,000 in student loan debt still outstanding from a graduate program he'd never finished, and a checking account that rarely cleared 4 figures. Marcus's read, delivered to Renata and then to me over a phone call I took sitting in my parked car outside my own office because I could not risk taking that call at home, was that Ryan was almost certainly a knowing accomplice, but a minor, low-level one. Someone who had let Derek use his name and a rented mail address in exchange for a flat fee, likely somewhere in the $5,000 range, without fully understanding, or perhaps without wanting to fully understand, the scale of what he was helping conceal. That mattered enormously, because a minor accomplice, faced with the right pressure at the right moment, becomes a cooperating witness far more easily than a mastermind does, and Renata began quietly laying groundwork for exactly that outcome. By the end of July, Renata had what she needed to describe, in a private meeting in her office with just the two of us and a pot of coffee neither of us drank, as prosecutable. Wire fraud, she explained, carried federal penalties of up to 20 years per count, and with 11 separate wire transfers, prosecutors would have 11 separate counts to work with if they chose to pursue the case that aggressively. Though realistically, she cautioned, a case like this, involving family, an elderly forgery victim, and a legitimate trust, was more likely to proceed through a combination of a criminal referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and a parallel civil action to recover the funds, unless the U.S. Attorney's Office decided to make an example of it, which happened more often than people assumed when elder exploitation was involved. She also, gently, asked me the question I had been avoiding answering even in my own head for 4 months. What did I actually want to happen to Derek? I told her the truth. I did not want him destroyed for the sake of destruction. I wanted the money back, every dollar of it, restored to a trust that belonged to children who hadn't even been born yet. I wanted Gerald Voss's name cleared publicly, not quietly settled in a way that let people keep whispering he'd been careless. And I wanted, more than either of those things, for Harold Whitfield to hear the truth from evidence so undeniable that no one at that table, not Patricia, not Vanessa, not Chip, would ever again be able to pretend I was the problem in this family. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who underestimated you, who mistook your quiet for weakness, you already know exactly the feeling I'm describing, and if that's you tonight, comment "I know that feeling" below so I know you're still with me, and hit subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where the second loop, the one about Derek and Brooke and exactly how long this family had been lying to my face, finally starts to unravel, and it gets a lot harder to watch before it gets satisfying. The affair had actually announced itself to me months before the photograph, in small, deniable pieces I'd trained myself, for a long time, not to add together, because adding them together meant admitting something I wasn't ready to hold. Derek had started going to the gym at 5:40 in the morning, a habit that appeared suddenly in February and produced, as far as I could tell, no visible change in his physique. He had started keeping his phone face down on every surface, a small physical tic that had never existed in the first 4 years of our marriage. He had stopped initiating any conversation about the future, no more idle talk about whether we'd try again after the miscarriage, no more mentions of the house in Lincoln Park we used to say we'd buy someday. I noticed all of it. I filed all of it under "marriage is hard right now," for longer than I'm proud of, because the alternative required a kind of courage I hadn't yet built. The photograph, when it finally landed in my hands, came from the most mundane source imaginable. Derek left his iPad unlocked on the kitchen counter one Tuesday evening while he showered, connected to the same cloud photo stream as his phone, and a new image simply populated the screen while I was standing there waiting for the coffee maker to finish. Derek and Brooke Calloway on a dock in Sausalito, his arm around her waist, both of them squinting into low golden light, the kind of photo two people take when they've stopped being careful. I did not touch the iPad. I did not need to. I photographed the screen with my own phone, logged the exact timestamp, and closed the cover exactly the way I'd found it. Once I let myself see it, the timeline assembled itself with sickening speed. I cross-referenced the 6 Bayview Charters bookings against Derek's stated business trips and found they matched perfectly, down to the day. I found, buried in an old group text thread from Vanessa's 40th birthday weekend, 18 months earlier, a message from Vanessa to Brooke that I only saw because Brooke had, at some point, replied all by mistake to a thread that included me. "Just don't let Dee's wife see this, LOL." Attached to nothing I could see anymore since the photo had been deleted, but the words alone told me something I'd suspected but hadn't wanted confirmed. Vanessa knew. Vanessa had known for at least 18 months, had joked about it in a group chat, had sat across from me at family dinners asking whether Derek and I were having money problems, while sitting on a secret that would have detonated the entire family if I'd known it at the time. I confirmed the affair's actual duration through Bayview Charter's own booking records, which Marcus Feld obtained through a public records request tied to the marina's business license disclosures. The first booking dated back 26 months, 4 months before Derek and I had even finished our first year of marriage's honeymoon phase, which meant this wasn't a recent lapse born of distance or dissatisfaction. It was foundational, something that had been running underneath our entire life together almost from the start. Brooke Calloway, I learned through a mutual acquaintance who didn't know she was giving me anything sensitive, had recently left her job at a Chicago marketing firm to work remotely for a client she described only as a private investment group, a description that lined up with a precision that made my hands shake the first time I understood it, with the consulting fees flowing out of Meridian Advisory Partners, LLC. Derek had not just been stealing from his family to fund an affair. He had been paying his mistress a salary out of stolen trust money, dressed up as legitimate consulting work, which meant Loop A and Loop B were never actually 2 separate stories. They were one story, wearing 2 different masks. I sat with that discovery for a full week before I told Renata, because it changed the emotional center of gravity of everything. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was a man who had built an entire second life, funded with his own father's money, run partly through the labor of his own sister's silence, all while I served him dinner, ironed his shirts, and defended him, more than once, to a mother-in-law who called me trash, while her golden son sat 2 feet away, saying nothing, letting her do it, because it was easier for him if I stayed exactly as small as everyone at that table needed me to be. Renata, when I told her, was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I still think about. "Elena, the money is a crime. The affair is a heartbreak. But the thing that's going to matter most, when you're standing in front of that family and it's finally time, is going to be exactly how much they all let you believe you deserved this." She was right, and by the time September arrived and Whitfield Structural Group's 40th anniversary gala loomed 2 weeks out, I had everything I needed. The forged signatures, the shell company, the wire transfer trail, Gerald Voss's sworn account, Ryan Callahan quietly agreeing to cooperate after Marcus Feld had a very direct conversation with him about the difference between being a minor accomplice who testified early and a co-defendant who didn't, the Bayview Charters records, and the group chat message that proved Vanessa had known and laughed about it. What I didn't have yet was a plan for how to deliver all of it in a single room in front of everyone in a way that could never be walked back, minimized, or spun by a family that had spent 40 years perfecting the art of controlling exactly what got said out loud. That plan, it turned out, would come from the one person in that family I had never once suspected of secretly being on my side. Harold Whitfield called me himself on a Wednesday afternoon in late August, which was unusual enough on its own. Harold almost never called anyone directly, preferring to route requests through Patricia or his longtime executive assistant, Marlene, and asked if I could meet him for coffee, just the 2 of us, at a diner near his office in Northbrook, rather than anywhere the family might overlap with us. I said yes immediately, my pulse climbing, wondering for one terrifying moment whether Derek had somehow sensed what I was building and warned his father to head me off. It was the opposite. Harold sat across from me in a cracked vinyl booth, ordered black coffee he barely touched, and said, without any preamble, Elena, I've known you 6 years, and I've watched my wife treat you like hired help for every single one of them, and I've let it happen because I told myself family peace was worth more than my pride standing up for you. I was wrong. And I think something's wrong with the trust, and I think you already know what it is, because I've watched you get quieter and quieter every time Gerald's name comes up, and you're the only person in this family sharp enough to have noticed something the rest of us missed. I have relived that conversation many times since, turning it over the way you turn over something precious you're afraid to drop. I told him everything, carefully, methodically, the way I'd present findings to any client, laying out the Meridian Shell Company, the forged signatures, Gerald's unwitting complicity, the $218,000, and, because he deserved the whole truth and not a curated version of it, Brooke Calloway, the Bayview Charter's bookings, and Vanessa's 18-month silence. Harold did not raise his voice. He did not slam his hand on the table the way I half expected a man of his generation and temperament to do. He went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math he desperately did not want to be doing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have. I built that company with my own 2 hands, starting with 11 men and a truck that didn't always start in winter. I built that trust so my grandchildren would never have to worry the way I worried at 23. And my own son has been robbing it blind to keep a mistress in Sausalito. And my daughter knew, and my wife's been treating the one person who actually caught it like garbage at her own dinner table. He looked at me and said, "You're not the accountant Derek married, Elena. You're the only person in this family who's told me the truth in years. What do you need from me?" What I needed from him changed everything about the timeline and the scale of what came next. With Harold's full backing, his willingness to formally authorize a forensic audit of the trust, his willingness to sit for an interview with federal investigators as the trust's founder and primary victim, and, critically, his connections, the case moved from a wife with a spreadsheet and a good lawyer to something federal investigators took seriously within days. Renata filed a formal criminal referral with the FBI's Chicago Field Office Financial Crimes Unit on September the 2nd, supported by Harold's sworn statement as trust grantor, Gerald Voss's corroborating account of the signature theft, the full wire transfer documentation, and Marcus Feld's forensic reconstruction of the Meridian Shell Company's formation and use. Special Agent Denise Okafor, a 12-year veteran of the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division, was assigned the case within a week, and in a phone call with Renata that Renata relayed to me almost word for word, Agent Okafor said the pattern, forged fiduciary signature, Shell LLC, systematic disbursements disguised as consulting fees, elder victim, was about as textbook as fraud gets, which usually means it's easy to prove once we're in the account records. The FBI's involvement moved fast in ways that surprised even Renata. Within 12 days, federal investigators had subpoenaed Meridian Advisory Partners LLC's actual bank records, which confirmed everything Marcus Feld's outside reconstruction had already shown, plus additional detail I hadn't been able to access on my own. A direct payment history from Meridian to Brooke Calloway, labeled in Meridian's own internal bookkeeping, kept sloppily on a shared spreadsheet Derek had apparently never imagined anyone outside the two of them would ever see, as BC, marketing retainer, totaling $31,000 paid out over 11 months, money that had never once produced a single marketing deliverable for a company that existed only on paper. Ryan Callahan, faced with a formal interview request from Agent Okafor and Marcus Feld's earlier warning ringing in his ears, retained his own attorney and agreed within 3 days to a proffer session, laying out, in detail, how Derek had approached him 18 months earlier asking to borrow his name for a business entity, paying him a flat $5,000 upfront and $500 a month afterward to maintain the mail forwarding address and occasionally forward documents, insisting he'd been told the money was family investment stuff. Totally legit, my dad knows about it. A claim Ryan said he'd chosen to believe because he didn't want to look too closely at $500 easy dollars a month. By mid-September, Agent Okafor confirmed to Renata in a conversation held 2 days before the Whitfield Structural Group 40th anniversary gala that the Bureau considered the evidentiary case against Derek Whitfield essentially complete for a wire fraud referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office, with elder financial exploitation enhancements likely given Gerald Voss's age and the forged fiduciary signature, and that an arrest, pending final prosecutorial sign-off, was probable within the following 2 to 3 weeks. Agent Okafor also confirmed something Renata had specifically asked her to clarify. given the volume of open financial crimes cases the Chicago field office was juggling and the public nature of the Whitfield family's upcoming gala, there was no operational reason the Bureau's timeline needed to accelerate or delay around any particular social event. Meaning, as Renata put it to me with the closest thing to a smile I ever saw cross her professional face, if you want a particular room and a particular audience for when this becomes undeniable, Elena, that's entirely a choice you get to make. The evidence doesn't care where it lands. You do. I thought about that sentence for 3 straight days. I thought about Patricia's voice calling me trash in front of 11 family members. I thought about Vanessa's 18 months of silence and her offhand cruelty about my little job downtown. I thought about Chip refusing an honest job while his brother stole from a dying man's, no, not dying, but aging, vulnerable, trusting, old accountant. I thought about Derek kissing my forehead in front of his mother, while a woman named Brooke Calloway sat somewhere in Chicago collecting a salary built entirely out of a lie. And I thought about Harold, 71 years old, sitting in that cracked vinyl booth, telling me I was the only person in his family who'd told him the truth in years. I called Renata back on the 4th day and told her I wanted the gala. I wanted every single person who had ever underestimated me sitting in one ballroom, in their best clothes, drinking champagne they didn't know they'd chosen as the last calm moment of their old lives, when it finally came apart. The 2 weeks between that phone call and the gala were the strangest of my life, because I had to keep living inside a marriage I already knew was over, inside a family I already knew was about to be publicly dismantled, while behaving, outwardly, exactly as I always had. I picked out a dress with Patricia over lunch, a lunch during which she suggested, unprompted, that I consider something structured, dear, in a darker shade, it photographs more forgivingly, and I smiled and said that sounded lovely. I helped Vanessa proof the seating chart, carefully steering my own table assignment away from Brooke Calloway, who Vanessa had, with breathtaking audacity, invited as her +1, listing her on the chart under V. Whitfield Pruitt Guest, as though 18 months of silence had earned her the right to bring her brother's mistress to their father's 40th anniversary celebration. I let Chip talk my ear off about a new venture idea, some kind of legacy documentary series he wanted Harold to fund about the company's history, without once mentioning that documenting Whitfield Structural Group's history was about to become considerably more complicated than Chip understood. Harold and I met twice more before the gala, both times at the same Northbrook diner, working through logistics with Renata joining by phone. The plan, once we settled on it, was precise in a way that honored both what I needed and what the law required. Agent Okafor confirmed the U.S. Attorney's Office had approved moving forward with an arrest warrant for Derek on wire fraud charges, with additional charges under review pending final documentation of the elder exploitation enhancement. The Bureau's standard procedure, given the amounts involved and Derek's lack of any prior record or flight risk, would typically be a coordinated, low-drama arrest at a private residence or office, not a public spectacle at a gala. Federal agents do not, as a rule, storm black-tie events for white-collar cases, and Renata was clear with me that no amount of dramatic staging on my part would change how professionally Agent Okafor's team intended to conduct the actual arrest. What I could control, and what Harold, as the Trust's founder and the gala's host, absolutely had the standing to control, was the moment the truth became known inside that room. Publicly, undeniably, before any quiet federal process could be spun by Patricia into a story about confusion or a misunderstanding with the paperwork, the way I had no doubt she would try to frame it the instant she caught wind of trouble. Harold decided, with a firmness that told me exactly how much resolve had been building in him for years, that he would speak first, publicly, at the gala itself, during the portion of the evening already scheduled for his anniversary toast, and that he would lay out, plainly, in front of 600 guests, employees, clients, and family, that the trust meant to protect his family's future had been defrauded by his own son, that his son's mistress had been paid with the stolen funds, that his daughter had known and said nothing, and that federal investigators were already involved. Agent Okafor, informed of this plan, made clear the Bureau would not object to Harold making a personal statement about his own family's private matters at his own event, though she cautioned that agents would not be attending in any official capacity that night, and that any actual arrest would proceed on the Bureau's own timeline, separately, likely within days rather than that same evening. That distinction mattered to me. I did not need Derek in handcuffs in front of 600 people to feel like justice had arrived. I needed the truth spoken out loud, in a room he could not spin, minimize, or charm his way out of, in front of every single person who had ever watched Patricia call me trash and said nothing. 3 nights before the gala, Derek came home late. Closing a client, he told me. The same tired lie I'd heard 100 times. And found me sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine I hadn't touched. And for one strange, quiet moment, he looked at me the way he used to look at me in the very early years, before the lies had calcified into a personality. "You okay?" he asked, and something in his voice was almost real. I told him I was just tired. He kissed the top of my head, the same performance he'd given his mother 100 times at 100 dinners, and I let him, because I needed 3 more days, and because some small, foolish, human part of me wanted one more ordinary night before everything I knew ended. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my home office at 2 in the morning with the external hard drive in my lap, the one that held every wire transfer, every forged signature, every Bayview Charters receipt, the group chat screenshot, Gerald Voss's statement, and I thought about the version of myself who had stood in Patricia's kitchen 6 years earlier, holding a serving spoon, absorbing the first cut of 1,000 small cruelties, telling herself that patience and competence would eventually be enough to earn a place at that table. I thought about how wrong that younger version of me had been about what would actually earn her a place. Not patience, not competence performed quietly in a corner, but the willingness, finally, to stop protecting people who had never once protected her. I closed the hard drive case, set my alarm for 7, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. The morning of the gala, I had my hair done at a small salon in Lincoln Park, sat in the chair while a stylist named Fatima wove soft curls into an updo, and made small talk about nothing, while 3 miles away, at the Drake Hotel, catering staff were setting 600 place settings on tables draped in cream linen, florists were arranging 40 years' worth of white orchids and blue delphinium into centerpieces that cost, I would later learn, $1,800 each, and Harold Whitfield was sitting alone in his office at Whitfield Structural Group's headquarters, rereading, for what he told me later was the 11th time, the printed timeline Renata had prepared for him, memorizing not just what he needed to say, but how he needed to say it. Steady, factual, undeniable, to a room full of people who had spent 40 years believing they understood exactly who the Whitfields were. The Drake Hotel's Gold Coast room glittered that night the way old money likes to glitter. Understated on purpose, chandeliers dimmed just enough to flatter, a 12-piece orchestra playing something warm and unobtrusive near the far wall, 600 guests in black tie moving between round tables, set with cream linen and centerpieces of white orchid and blue delphinium that swayed gently every time a server passed. I arrived at 7:40 in a deep emerald gown Patricia had never seen, had never approved, had never had the chance to comment on, because I had chosen it myself, alone, 3 weeks earlier, the first purchase in 6 years of marriage I hadn't quietly run past anyone's opinion first. Derek met me in the lobby, handsome in his tuxedo, and told me I looked beautiful, and I thanked him, and I meant it as a kind of private irony he could not possibly understand yet. Patricia found me within the first 15 minutes, air-kissing my cheek, murmuring, "The emerald is a bold choice, dear," in a tone designed to sound like praise while functioning as anything but, and then swept off to greet a state senator's wife with a warmth she had never once extended to me in 6 years. Vanessa arrived shortly after, Brooke Calloway on her arm in a champagne-colored gown, both of them laughing at something as they crossed the room, and I watched Brooke's eyes find mine across the ballroom for exactly 1 second before sliding away, and I understood, in that single second, that she knew I knew, or at least suspected I might, and had decided to attend anyway, banking on exactly the kind of social armor this family had always provided her. Chip drifted through the crowd with a drink in each hand, telling anyone who'd listen about his legacy documentary idea, oblivious entirely to the fact that the legacy in question was about to be rewritten in front of him, in ways no documentary crew could have scripted. Dinner passed the way these dinners always pass. Seared scallops, a wine list Derek made a show of discussing knowledgeably with our table mates, polite conversation about the construction industry, and a recent municipal contract Whitfield Structural Group had won. Patricia's laugh carrying 2 tables over at something the mayor's chief of staff had said. I ate almost nothing. I kept my eyes, more than once, on Harold, seated at the head table beside Patricia, upright, composed, a man who had run 600 employees and 40 years of contracts without ever once losing his nerve in public, and who was, I knew, holding folded index cards in his jacket pocket that would end his marriage, his son's freedom, and his family's carefully constructed image, all within the next hour. At 9:15 the orchestra quieted, and the MC, a longtime Whitfield Structural Group executive named Owen Marsh, no relation to me despite the shared last name, a coincidence Patricia had found endlessly, tediously amusing over the years, stepped to the small stage at the front of the ballroom to introduce Harold's anniversary remarks. Applause rolled through the room. Warm and expectant, 600 people ready for a nostalgic speech about 11 men and a truck that didn't always start in winter. Harold rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, walked to the podium with the same unhurried gait he used on job sites, and set his index cards down without looking at them. 40 years ago, he began, and his voice, amplified, filled the room. I started this company with 11 men, a used flatbed truck, and $4,000 I'd saved working double shifts for 6 years. I want to thank every person in this room who helped build what we have now, our clients, our employees, some of whom have been with me since 1981, and my family, who I have loved every single day of this journey, sometimes better than I've shown them. He paused. The room, sensing nothing yet, laughed warmly at what sounded like a self-deprecating aside. I also built something else 31 years ago, a family trust, $4 million, meant to make sure my grandchildren and their children never had to worry the way I worried at 23 years old with nothing in my pocket but a work ethic and a prayer. Another pause, longer this time, and something in his tone made the laughter in the room start to fade. $218,400 was stolen out of that trust over the last 31 months, Harold said, and the room went very, very quiet. The particular quiet of 600 people simultaneously realizing a speech has become something else entirely. It was taken through 11 wire transfers, disguised as consulting fees to a shell company, authorized using a forged signature belonging to Gerald Voss, our family's accountant of almost 30 years, a man who did nothing wrong and who I want to publicly apologize to tonight, because for a period of time, some of us wondered if he'd made a careless mistake. He did not. His signature was stolen from him. I watched Derek's face from 3 tables away. I watched the exact moment the blood left it. That shell company, Harold continued, his voice steady, almost gentle, the tone of a man delivering the worst news of someone's life with the same care he'd use breaking ground on a building that mattered to him, paid a portion of that stolen money as a monthly retainer to a woman named Brooke Calloway for marketing work that was never actually performed, because Brooke Calloway was not being paid to do marketing. She was being paid to be my son Derek's mistress in Sausalito, California, for the last 26 months, using money stolen from his own family's trust to fund it. A sound moved through the ballroom, a collective inhale, 600 people turning, almost as one organism, to find Derek's table, to find Brooke's, and I watched Brooke Calloway's champagne-colored gown seem to drain of color along with her face, watched Vanessa freeze mid-reach for her water glass, watched the state senator's wife 2 tables over lean toward her husband and whisper something behind a raised hand. "My daughter Vanessa," Harold said, and his voice cracked, just barely, on the word daughter, knew about this affair for at least 18 months, and said nothing to anyone in this family, including the woman being deceived, who happens to be one of the most honest, hard-working people I have ever had the privilege of calling my daughter-in-law. He looked, for the first time since he'd begun speaking, directly at me, across 600 people and 40 round tables, and something in his face, grief, apology, a kind of fierce protectiveness I had waited 6 years for someone in this family to show me, made my eyes sting for the first time all evening. Elena Marsh is the person who found all of this. Not because she went looking to destroy this family, but because she is one of the finest forensic accountants in this state, and she noticed a $2,000 discrepancy that everyone else, including me, including our accountant, including apparently my own son, assumed she'd never catch. She spent 9 months building an airtight case, working with federal investigators, protecting Gerald Voss's reputation, protecting this trust, protecting this family's future, while being called, and here his voice hardened into something I had never heard from him before, something close to fury, trash, at my own dinner table, by my own wife, in front of 11 members of this family, and staying silent about it, because she is a better person than most of the people in this room tonight, myself included. Patricia, beside him at the head table, had gone rigid, her hand frozen around the stem of her champagne glass, her face doing something I had genuinely never seen it do before. Fear. Real fear, not the practiced social discomfort she deployed at charity auctions when a donation total came in low. "Patricia," Harold said, turning to her, and the entire ballroom seemed to lean in. I have watched you treat this woman like she was beneath our family for 6 years, and I said nothing, because I told myself keeping the peace mattered more than defending her. I was wrong every single time I let that happen, and I am done being wrong about it tonight." Patricia's champagne glass slipped from her fingers. It didn't shatter dramatically. Hotel carpet absorbs falls better than marble. But the soft, wet thud of it hitting the floor, the small dark stain spreading across cream carpet in front of 600 witnesses, landed in that silent ballroom, louder than any shattering glass could have. Derek stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, started toward the stage, said something that came out half-formed. "Dad, this isn't, you can't just—" And Harold, still at the podium, did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the microphone made raising his voice unnecessary. "The FBI is already involved, Derek. Special Agent Denise Okafor has been building a case against you for weeks with evidence your own wife assembled, and your own former college friend Ryan Callahan corroborated in a sworn statement. This isn't a conversation we're having tonight. This is a fact I'm telling 600 witnesses, because I am done letting this family control what people are allowed to know about what actually happens inside it." Two of the hotel's private security staff, alerted in advance by Harold's own head of corporate security as a precaution, moved quietly toward the edge of the room, not to intervene dramatically, just to be present, a visible signal that this was no longer a scene anyone could smooth over with charm. I did not stand up. I did not need to make a scene of my own. Harold had already made the only scene that mattered. I sat very still at my table, hands folded in my lap, and let 600 people watch my mother-in-law's champagne glass bleed into cream carpet. Watched Vanessa's face crumple from shock into something like panic as her own guests began quietly, deliberately, turning their backs to her table. Watched Brooke Calloway stand up so abruptly her chair scraped audibly across the floor and walk, fast, toward the exit. Watched Derek stand frozen between his father at the podium and his wife at table 12. A man suddenly discovering that every room in his life had run out of places to charm his way into safety. Chip, 3 tables away, had gone completely still, his half-finished drink forgotten in his hand, staring at his father with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not amusement, not detachment, something closer to the first real fear he'd ever felt about his own future. The sudden, dawning understanding that the money that funded every failed venture, every rent-free guest house year, every casual assumption that someone else would always cover the difference, had just been publicly revealed to be finite, contested, and, as of tonight, under a level of family scrutiny that had never existed before. Harold stepped down from the podium without another word, walked directly past his wife's spilled champagne, past his frozen son, and came to my table, where he pulled out the empty chair beside me. Derek's overturned, abandoned chair, actually, righted first with a steady hand, and sat down next to me in front of every single person who had ever underestimated me, and said quietly, just for me, though the whole room was still watching, "Thank you for telling me the truth, when it would have been easier not to." I told him I was sorry it had to happen this way, at his anniversary, in front of everyone he'd built this company for. He shook his head. 40 years of building something, he said, means nothing if I let the people inside it lie to protect themselves instead of protect each other. You protected this family more than anyone else in it has in a long time, Elena. I should have seen that a long time ago. The orchestra did not resume. The evening did not continue as planned. 600 guests began, gradually, quietly, to gather coats and purses, murmuring to each other in the specific hushed tone reserved for witnessing something they would talk about for years, while hotel staff moved efficiently to begin clearing a gala that had ended. For all practical purposes, the moment Harold Whitfield set down his index cards and told 600 witnesses the truth about his own family, live, unscripted, and utterly, permanently undeniable. What happened in the 40 minutes after Harold sat down beside me is something I've had to piece together, partly from my own memory and partly from what Renata, who had been seated 3 tables back specifically to watch the room for exactly this purpose, told me afterward, because my own perception of that stretch of time has the strange, fractured quality that shock produces, vivid in some details, entirely missing in others. I remember Patricia not moving from her chair for what felt like a very long time, staring at the dark stains spreading across the carpet where her champagne glass had fallen, her face doing something I had genuinely never seen it do in 6 years. Nothing. No performance, no recalibration, no smooth pivot to damage control. Just stillness, the particular stillness of a woman who has spent her entire adult life curating exactly what other people are permitted to know about her family, watching that curation collapse in front of 600 witnesses in under 4 minutes. I remember Vanessa trying, twice, to approach me, both times stopped by the simple fact that I would not make eye contact with her, would not offer her the social opening she needed to begin explaining herself, because I had decided, somewhere around the 5th month of building this case, that Vanessa did not get to narrate her own redemption arc to me in real time at the very event where her silence had just been publicly exposed. She stood near my table for almost a full minute, opened her mouth twice, and each time I simply looked past her, toward Harold, toward the orchestra's empty risers, toward anything that wasn't her face, until she finally retreated, and I watched 3 separate groups of gala guests, women Patricia had known for decades. A city councilwoman, the wife of one of Whitfield Structural Group's largest clients, visibly, deliberately angle their bodies away from her as she passed. The particular social violence of a room that has decided, collectively and instantly, who it is no longer willing to be seen with. I remember Derek finally reaching my table, kneeling beside my chair in a tuxedo that suddenly looked like a costume rather than clothing, saying my name in a voice I'd never heard him use before, stripped of every performance he'd built our entire marriage on top of. "Elena, please, we can fix this. I can explain the money. I can... Brooke doesn't mean anything. It was never..." And I let him get exactly that far before I said the only sentence I had prepared for this moment, the one Renata and I had discussed weeks earlier, not because I needed a clever line, but because I needed, after 6 years of being interrupted, spoken over, and managed, to say something and have it be the last word. "You don't get to explain this to me at a podium. 600 people just heard your father use to tell the truth for you. You had 6 years and 11 wire transfers and 26 months to explain it to me privately, Derek, and you chose Brooke and a shell company instead. I'm done." I stood up, smoothed my emerald dress, and walked out of the Gold Coast room on Harold's arm, past Patricia still frozen in her chair, past Vanessa being quietly, publicly abandoned by her own social circle, past Chip standing motionless with a drink he'd forgotten he was holding, and out into the cool September night, where Renata was already waiting by the valet stand with my coat. Special Agent Denise Okafor's team executed the arrest warrant 6 days later on a Thursday morning at Derek's actual place of residence, which, by then, was no longer our shared apartment but a corporate short-term rental Harold's attorneys had arranged for him to vacate to immediately following the gala. A small, humiliating detail Derek would later describe to a mutual acquaintance as temporary. A word that, like so many words Derek used, no longer meant what he wanted it to mean. The arrest was quiet, procedural, exactly as unglamorous as Agent Okafor had told Renata it would be. No cameras, no dramatic takedown, just 2 federal agents at a door at 7:15 in the morning with a warrant for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft related to the forged trustee's signature, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult given Gerald Voss's age. Charges that, combined, carried a potential sentence. Renata told me with the flat precision of someone who has delivered this kind of news many times before, of up to 22 years, though any actual sentence, given Derek's lack of prior record and the likelihood of a plea agreement, would almost certainly land somewhere far shorter. Probably in a range federal sentencing guidelines would place between 3 and 6 years, with restitution of the full $218,400 ordered as a condition regardless of the exact prison term. The months that followed the arrest moved through the legal system with a slowness that surprised me, given how fast everything had felt in the weeks leading up to the gala. Derek was released on bond within 2 days, restricted from any contact with trust accounts or financial institutions without prior approval, and spent the following 7 months living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Skokie that Harold's attorneys made clear, through Renata, would receive absolutely no financial support from the family, a condition Harold insisted on personally, over Patricia's initial, half-hearted objection that he still needs somewhere to live, Harold, he's still our son. Harold's response to that, which Renata relayed to me because Harold himself found it too raw to repeat, was simply, he can live somewhere he pays for with his own money. Patricia, the way Elena has been doing her entire adult life. Ryan Callahan's cooperation agreement, finalized in November, resulted in him pleading guilty to a single reduced charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, receiving a sentence of 2 years of probation and a restitution obligation of $11,000. The total amount he'd personally been paid to lend his name and mail address to Meridian Advisory Partners, LLC, in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony against Derek. Ryan later sent me, through Renata, A handwritten letter I have never fully forgiven him for, but did, eventually, read twice, apologizing for not asking harder questions, and admitting he'd told himself the arrangement was harmless because he needed the money and didn't want to know more than he had to. I don't know if I believe he was as naive as he claimed. I believe he made a choice to stop looking closely at something convenient, which is its own kind of guilt, even if the law treated it as a lesser one. Gerald Voss's reputation, which had been quietly, informally questioned by exactly the kind of family whisper network Patricia specialized in, well, he is getting older, dear, mistakes happen, was fully and publicly restored the moment Harold's gala speech named him, unambiguously, as a victim rather than a negligent party. Gerald retired formally that winter, at 79, with a farewell dinner Harold insisted on hosting personally, a small, warm gathering of 11 people at a steakhouse in Northbrook. Nothing like the 600-person spectacle of the gala, where Harold stood up, unprompted, and toasted, the man who never once, in 30 years, gave this family a single reason to doubt him, until we let someone else's lie make us doubt him anyway. Gerald cried. I cried too, quietly, into a cloth napkin, because it was the first time since this entire ordeal began that a story ended with someone's name being cleared instead of dragged further through it. Derek's plea agreement, reached in the following February after nearly 5 months of negotiation between his defense attorney and the U.S. Attorney's Office, resulted in him pleading guilty to wire fraud and aggravated identity theft related to the forged trustee's signature, with the elder financial exploitation enhancement ultimately withdrawn in exchange for a longer agreed sentencing range on the primary counts. A negotiation Renata explained to me was fairly typical. Prosecutors trading a harder-to-prove enhancement for a cleaner, faster resolution on charges they were confident about. Derek was sentenced that April to 4 years and 2 months in federal prison, along with a restitution order for the full $218,400, to be paid first through the liquidation of assets, the leased BMW, a watch collection valued at $31,000 that I hadn't even known existed until it appeared on his asset disclosure, and a small brokerage account in his name worth $62,000, with the remainder to be garnished from any future earnings for as long as necessary. He would serve his sentence at a low-security federal facility in Terre Haute, Indiana, a detail Patricia apparently found some private comfort in, according to Vanessa, because it was not one of the scary ones. A sentence I heard secondhand and found myself laughing at, alone in my car, with an edge that surprised me. At Derek's sentencing hearing, which I attended not out of any lingering attachment but because Renata told me victims of financial crimes are entitled to make an impact statement and I intended to use every minute of mine, I stood in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, in a plain navy suit rather than anything designed to make a statement, and read a statement I had drafted and revised 11 times over 3 weeks. I did not raise my voice. I described, in plain, factual language, the $218,400, the 26 months of deception, the forged signature that nearly cost an innocent 78-year-old man his reputation, and then I said the only part of the statement that wasn't purely factual. I spent 6 years being told, quietly and repeatedly, by this family, that I was lucky to be included. I have since learned that the people who kept telling me that were the ones who needed me not to notice what they were doing. I am not lucky to have survived this marriage. I am simply the person in this family who was paying attention, and paying attention, it turns out, is its own kind of power, whether or not anyone ever thanks you for using it. Derek did not look at me during the statement. He looked at the table in front of him, at his own hands, the way a man looks at things when he has finally run out of rooms to charm his way into safety. It has been 14 months now since that gala, and I want to tell you what happened to each of them, individually, because I think the specific shape of consequence matters more than any general statement about karma or justice. And because for 6 years I watched this family avoid consequences with such practiced ease that I think it's worth being precise about what it actually looked like when they finally arrived. Patricia lost, first and most immediately, her position on the boards of 3 charitable organizations, the Lake Forest Symphony Guild, a Children's Hospital Auxiliary Board, and a Preservation Society for Historic North Shore Estates, all of which quietly, within 6 weeks of the gala, declined to renew her seats when they came up for their annual review, citing, in careful nonprofit language, a desire to refresh board composition, language everyone involved understood to mean nobody wanted a fraud scandal attached to their fundraising letterhead. Patricia's social calendar, which had for decades run 3 to 4 events deep every week, thinned to almost nothing within 4 months. Women she had known for 30 years stopped including her in the smaller, more intimate gatherings, the lunches and the garden club meetings, the places where real belonging lives, even as they remained polite enough to still invite her to the large, anonymous events where a snub would be too visible. Harold did not leave her, he told me once, over coffee at the same Northbrook diner where our story had turned, that he'd considered it seriously for the first time in 46 years of marriage, but ultimately decided that the version of accountability that mattered more to him was making sure Patricia understood, completely and permanently, that her behavior toward me had cost her something real, not abstract. He requires her, now, to attend quarterly meetings with a family therapist alongside him, a condition of their continued marriage that Patricia agreed to with what Harold describes as the reluctant grace of a woman who finally understood there was no version of this where she got to pretend nothing happened. Patricia has not called me trash again. She has not, in 14 months, called me much of anything at all, which I have come to understand is its own kind of answer. Vanessa's consequences arrived through a mechanism I hadn't anticipated, but which, in retrospect, made perfect sense. Her social circle, the one she had spent decades curating and performing wealth for, evaporated almost entirely within the first 3 months. The 18-month-old text message admitting she'd known about the affair became, somehow, semi-public. I never confirmed exactly how, though I have my suspicions it traveled through Brooke's own furious circle after Brooke herself was publicly exposed and looking for someone else to blame. And the specific betrayal of watching a wife serve dinner to a family that was actively laughing about her husband's affair behind her back proved to be a cruelty even Vanessa's most loyal friends couldn't fully rationalize away. Her third divorce filing, from a boyfriend of 2 years she'd been pressuring toward marriage, came 4 months after the gala, with the boyfriend's stated reason, delivered through mutual friends, being that he'd seen enough of how this family treats people who trust them. Vanessa, at 39 now, took the junior project coordinator position at Whitfield Structural Group that Chip had once waved off as beneath his content strategy ambitions. Harold offered it to her directly, not as a favor, he told her explicitly, but as the only job in the company he trusted her enough yet to be given, entry-level, with real oversight, the first actual paying job of her adult life. She has, according to Harold, been showing up on time every day for 11 months, which he describes with visible surprise as genuinely more than I expected. Chip's reckoning came fastest and hardest, mostly because Chip had the least foundation underneath him to begin with. Harold, in the aftermath of the gala, conducted a full financial review of every family member's relationship to the company and the trust, and discovered that Chip's various seeded ventures over the years, the cold brew subscription, the grooming line, the real estate flip, the content agency, had consumed, cumulatively, just over $310,000 of Harold's personal money. None of it structured as a loan, all of it simply given, quietly, over 9 years. Harold did not sue his own son, but he did something Chip experienced as considerably more painful. He stopped. No more seed money, no more guest house rent waiver. Chip was given 4 months' notice to either begin paying market rent of $2,200 a month for the guest house or vacate it, and he chose, after 2 increasingly desperate months of searching for another venture to pitch, to vacate. Chip now works, as of 8 months ago, as an actual project coordinator trainee at a mid-sized general contractor in Elgin, a company with no relation to Whitfield Structural Group, making $51,000 a year, living in a 1-bedroom apartment he pays for himself, a fact he has, according to a mutual family friend, started describing, without apparent irony, as really grounding actually, language that suggests he has not yet fully metabolized how much of his previous life had been an elaborate performance of self-sufficiency, rather than the real thing. Brooke Calloway's professional life, built almost entirely on the fiction of a remote consulting role that had, in reality, been a salary for being someone's mistress, dissolved the moment Meridian Advisory Partners LLC's bank records became part of a federal case file. She was never criminally charged, receiving payments from a man who told her, credibly enough that prosecutors found no basis to pursue her, that the money was legitimate business income, did not rise to the level of a provable crime on her end, but the social cost proved steep regardless. Her marketing career in Chicago effectively ended. The industry is small enough, and the story traveled fast enough through group chats and industry gossip, that no firm wanted the reputational risk of hiring the woman from the Whitfield scandal. She moved, according to someone who still follows her online, to Denver about 7 months ago, and I have made a deliberate, disciplined choice not to think about her more than that sentence requires. And Derek Derek is 11 months into a sentence that will run, with credit for good behavior, somewhere close to 3.5 more years. I have received 2 letters from him, both of which I read once, calmly, and did not respond to, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer owe him access to my attention, a boundary that took me most of my adult life to understand I was allowed to set. Harold visits him monthly. Patricia has visited twice. I have not visited at all, and I don't intend to, and I want to be honest that this isn't a triumphant, cinematic kind of peace. Some days it still just feels like a wound that's scarred over rather than healed, and I think that's a more truthful thing to say than pretending revenge, even successful revenge, erases 6 years of believing you were loved by people who were, the entire time, quietly deciding you were worth less than the money they were stealing. My own life, in the 14 months since that gala, has rebuilt itself in ways I genuinely could not have predicted from inside the marriage I was still living through that spring. The divorce finalized in June, faster and more cleanly than most contested divorces, mostly because Derek's attorney understood, correctly, that fighting me on anything financial was a losing strategy given the paper trail I'd already built for entirely different purposes. I kept the Lincoln Park apartment. I kept my retirement accounts, untouched by anything Derek had done because I'd always instinctively kept them separate. A decision that had felt, at the time, like paranoia, and later felt like the only genuinely self-protective instinct I'd trusted in years. I did not ask for alimony. Renata thought I was insane for waiving it, and told me so directly, twice. But I told her the truth. I did not want one more dollar of my life connected to Derek Whitfield in any ongoing way. Not even a check that arrived monthly as a reminder of what he owed me. I wanted a clean line. I got one. Professionally, the case became, in the specific and slightly uncomfortable way that these things happen in a small industry, something people talked about. Not by name, not publicly. Renata and I were careful about confidentiality throughout, and neither Harold nor I ever gave interviews or comments to the 2 local business reporters who sniffed around the story after the U.S. Attorney's Office issued its press release on Derek's sentencing. But within the tight, gossipy world of forensic accounting and litigation support in Chicago, it became known, in the way these things become known, that the Whitfield trust fraud case had been cracked, essentially single-handedly, by a forensic accountant working nights on her own family's finances with nothing but a spreadsheet and an unwillingness to look away from a number that didn't add up. Harrow and Voss made me a full partner that November, 6 months ahead of the normal track, and the firm's managing partner, a notoriously understated man named Julian Ashford who had mentored me since I was 28, told me, in the closest thing to sentimentality I'd ever heard from him, "Elena, you've always been good at this job. What happened this year proved you're good at it even when it costs you something. That's rarer than talent." I started, that same November, teaching a continuing education seminar for the State CPA Society on detecting fiduciary fraud in family trusts, using, with every identifying detail changed, dates shifted, names invented, amounts adjusted, the architecture of what I'd found in my own life as a teaching case. Because if even one other person in that room could catch a forged signature or a shell company 6 months earlier than I did, faster than the 31 months it took me, then something good had come out of the worst year of my life beyond just my own vindication. Harold and I speak now more than Derek and I ever really did, in the sense that mattered. He calls me most Sundays, not out of obligation, but because, as he told me once, bluntly, over the phone, "You're the daughter this family should have raised, Elena, and I'm not going to pretend that fact ended just because the marriage did." He asked me, that same call, whether I'd be willing to sit on Whitfield Structural Group's board as an independent financial advisor, a paid position entirely separate from any family entitlement, based purely on my professional credentials and, he said without embarrassment, his complete trust in my judgment after everything I'd protected for this family without being asked to. I accepted. My first board meeting was in January, in a conference room 3 floors above the office where Derek used to keep his fictional managing director business cards, and I sat at the head of the table across from 6 senior executives who had built real careers on real work, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, entirely uncomplicatedly proud of exactly who I was. I started dating again in the spring, cautiously, nothing serious yet, mostly because I've realized I'm in no rush to hand anyone access to the parts of my life I spent 6 years learning to protect too casually. I bought a small lake house near Lake Geneva in August, entirely on my own name, with my own money, the first major purchase of my adult life that involved consulting exactly 0 other people's opinions about whether the color of the shutters, photographed forgivingly. I go there most weekends now, alone or with my father, who drove up from Rockford the first weekend I owned it and stood on the small dock looking out at the water and told me, quietly, that he was proud of me, not for the money or the case or the gala, but for the fact that I'd spent 9 months building a case so careful, so patient, so relentlessly factual, that not one person in that family, however desperately they might have wanted to, could ever credibly claim I'd made any of it up, exaggerated any of it, or acted out of anything other than the truth. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I've had 14 months to think about what it actually is, past the satisfying cinematic version where the villain gets caught and the mother-in-law drops her champagne glass, I think it's this. The people who tell you, repeatedly, that you're lucky to be tolerated are almost always the people who benefit most from you never testing that claim. I spent 3 years of my marriage believing that my worth in that family was something I had to earn through patience, through quiet competence, through never once making anyone uncomfortable with the plain, provable truth of what I could see. It took me nearly a decade of professional training in exactly this kind of fraud to finally trust myself enough to apply it inside my own home, and I think about all the women who never get that training, who never build that spreadsheet, who spend their entire lives absorbing the same quiet cruelty I absorbed at that dinner table, and never once get the vindication of watching a room full of witnesses finally understand exactly who they were dealing with. I got mine. I don't take that for granted, and I don't think it makes me special. I think it makes me lucky, in the one specific, narrow way that matters. I happen to have exactly the skill set required to prove, beyond any argument, that I had been telling the truth the entire time. So I'll ask you the same question I've been asking myself for 14 months now. How long would you stay quiet, at a table that kept insisting you were lucky just to be sitting there, before you finally opened the one drawer you'd been too afraid to open? There's a part of this story I haven't told you yet, because it took me the longest to be able to say out loud, even to myself, and I think it belongs here, in the truth of it, rather than smoothed over the way I smoothed it over for 2 years at every family dinner where someone asked, with varying degrees of genuine interest, when Derek and I were finally going to give Harold and Patricia grandchildren. I was pregnant once, in the 3rd year of our marriage, 11 weeks along, further than I'd let myself hope for given how carefully we'd tried and failed for the previous 8 months. I found out on a Tuesday morning in a bathroom in our old apartment, sat on the edge of the tub for 20 minutes doing math about due dates and nursery colors before I let myself walk out and tell Derek, who cried, actually cried, real tears, the kind I'd stopped believing he still had in him by the time I found the Meridian Shell Company 2 years later. I lost the pregnancy at 11 weeks and 4 days, on a Thursday, at a routine ultrasound appointment where the technician's face changed in a way I will never forget. That particular controlled stillness of someone delivering news they've delivered too many times before. I told Patricia and Harold together, at their kitchen island, 6 days later, because Derek insisted we needed to get ahead of the story, before someone at the country club heard secondhand that I'd been seen leaving a hospital. Harold hugged me, immediately, without hesitation, the first real physical comfort anyone in that family had ever offered me. Patricia's response, delivered while refilling her own coffee, not mine, was, "Well, these things happen for a reason sometimes, dear. Maybe it wasn't the right timing." I did not cry in front of her. I have never once, in 6 years, cried in front of Patricia Whitfield. And I understand now that this withholding, this refusal to hand her the satisfaction of watching me break, was the earliest version of the same instinct that would eventually let me sit through an entire gala watching her drop a champagne glass without flinching. I learned, that Thursday in her kitchen, exactly how much emotional safety this family was willing to extend me, and it was less than what most people would extend a stranger at a bus stop. Derek, in the weeks after the miscarriage, was tender in a way that felt, at the time, like proof the marriage was fundamentally sound, even if his family was complicated. I understand now, with the specific, unforgiving clarity that hindsight provides once you've mapped a man's financial life down to the dollar, that this tenderness coincided almost exactly with the earliest Bayview Charters booking I ever found in his records. 11 weeks after my miscarriage, Derek chartered his first weekend boat trip with Brooke Calloway in Sausalito, a fact I did not discover until 2 years later, but which, once I did discover it, retroactively poisoned every memory I had of him holding me during that grief, because I could no longer tell which version of his comfort had been real and which had simply been management, the same skill he applied to his mother, to his business cards, to every room he'd ever walked into needing people to believe something about him that wasn't quite true. I tell you this not for sympathy, though I understand if it lands that way, but because I think it explains something important about the 9 months I spent building that case, with what people later described admiringly as remarkable composure. I was not composed because the betrayal didn't hurt. I was composed because I had already, 3 years earlier, learned exactly what this family did with my pain when I showed it to them plainly. Patricia turned it into a lesson about timing. Derek turned it into a performance he could later use to fund an affair, and only Harold, quietly, without fanfare, offered me anything that resembled real care. So, when I found the fraud, and later the affair, I made a decision I'd been unconsciously training toward for years. I would not hand this family my grief again until I could hand it to them alongside undeniable proof, in a room they couldn't spin, on terms I controlled completely. Renata, when I finally told her about the miscarriage, months into building the case, went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Elena, that's the moment I understood why you were building this case the way you were building it. Like evidence, not like a wound. Most people can't do both at once. You did." I think that's the truest thing anyone said to me that entire year. There's one more moment from the gala I haven't told you about yet, because I've been saving it, and I think you'll understand why once you hear it. After Harold sat down beside me and before I stood up to leave on his arm, Patricia, still frozen in her chair with the dark stain of spilled champagne spreading across the carpet in front of her, finally looked up and found my eyes across the table, and for one unguarded second, stripped of every practiced expression she'd spent 40 years perfecting, she simply looked lost. The way people look when the story they've told themselves about who they are has just been publicly contradicted by 600 witnesses. I remembered in that exact second the very first thing she'd ever said to me, 6 years earlier, in her kitchen, after I told her my father was a union electrician in Rockford. "Well, isn't that useful?" Delivered with such casual, practiced dismissal that it had taken my breath away at 28 years old, standing there with a serving spoon in my hand, understanding for the first time exactly how small this family intended to make me feel. I did not say anything cruel to her in that ballroom. I did not need to, and I had promised myself months earlier that I would not become someone who needed to. But I held her eyes for exactly as long as it took to let her see that I remembered, that I had always remembered, every single one of the small cruelties she'd delivered over 6 years with a smile, and then I looked away, toward Harold, toward the door, toward the rest of my life, because some sentences don't need to be spoken out loud to land exactly where they're meant to. I want to go back for a moment to how the actual forensic work got done, because I think the mechanics matter and because I've had more than one person ask me, since all of this became known in careful, unnamed whispers around the Chicago financial community, how exactly you catch something like this when the person hiding it has every reason in the world and every resource to keep you from seeing it. The honest answer is that fraud, almost without exception, is defeated by boredom, the specific, patient, unglamorous boredom of reconciling the same numbers against each other, over and over, until a pattern that shouldn't exist reveals itself simply because you refuse to stop looking. I built 17 separate spreadsheet tabs over those 9 months, one for the trust distribution statements, one for Meridian's formation documents, one for Derek's 4 credit card accounts cross-referenced by date, one specifically tracking the Bayview Charter's bookings against Derek's stated travel calendar, one comparing Gerald Voss's authentic signature against the 11 forged authorizations pixel by pixel using a signature comparison method Renata's forensic document examiner taught me, measuring stroke pressure variance, letter spacing consistency, and the angle of ascenders and descenders, the same techniques used in courtroom admissible handwriting analysis. I taught myself, over those months, to read a bank wire's routing metadata the way some people read tea leaves. Learn the specific signature of a shell company designed by someone who understood just enough about business formation to look legitimate to a casual glance, and not nearly enough to survive a forensic accountant's actual scrutiny. Renata Osei's own path to becoming the woman who eventually cracked this case open with me deserves its own telling, because I don't think I would have trusted anyone else enough to hand them my entire family's destruction. Renata grew up 2 streets over from my father in Rockford, the daughter of a hospital custodian and a woman who cleaned houses 6 days a week, and she has told me, more than once, that she decided to become a lawyer at 14 years old after watching a landlord evict her family from an apartment, using a lease clause her own mother couldn't read well enough in English to understand she was signing away. She worked days as a paralegal and took night classes for 6 years to get through law school, passed the bar on her first attempt at 29, and built her practice, deliberately, around exactly the kind of case most firms consider too messy, too personal, too family to be profitable. Financial exploitation hidden inside relationships built on trust. Money crimes inside families are the ones everyone wants to look away from, she told me once, in the early weeks of building my case, because looking at them means admitting love doesn't automatically protect you from theft. I got tired of watching people learn that the hard way, with no one in their corner. She had, by the time I called her, successfully litigated 11 similar cases over 14 years, and I understood, watching her work my own case with the same unhurried, methodical intensity she'd clearly brought to all 11 of the others, that I had not simply hired a lawyer. I had found someone who understood, from childhood, exactly what it costs a person to finally stop protecting the people who are quietly destroying them. Harold and Patricia's family therapy, which began the month after the gala and continues, as far as I know, to this day, produced one detail Harold shared with me that I think about often. Their therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Renfrew, who specializes in family systems disrupted by financial betrayal, apparently asked Patricia in an early session to describe what she believed her role in the family actually was, and Patricia, after a long silence, said, "I thought my job was to make sure this family always looked like it deserved everything it had." Harold told me he'd sat with that answer for days afterward, turning it over because it explained so much of what I'd endured for 6 years without ever having language for it. Patricia's coldness toward me had never really been about me specifically. It had been about maintaining an image so polished that no outsider, including a union electrician's daughter with a forensic accounting license, could ever be allowed to suggest that image wasn't entirely earned. I don't forgive Patricia for how she treated me, but I understand her now in a way I didn't before, and understanding, I've learned, is not the same thing as absolution, and you're allowed to hold both at once. I think about our wedding day sometimes, now, with a clarity I didn't have access to while I was living inside the marriage, because hindsight has a way of turning a happy memory into a document you can finally read correctly. We married on a Saturday in June, 6 years before the gala, at a stone chapel in Lake Forest that Patricia had insisted on, followed by a reception for 240 guests at a private club overlooking the lake. An event that cost, according to the final invoice I found years later while reconciling old accounts, $91,000. Of which my own parents contributed $11,000, every cent they had comfortably available, and the rest was covered, quietly, by Harold, in a gesture that felt, at the time, like generosity, and which I now understand was also, in its own way, a kind of ledger entry Patricia expected me to spend the rest of my marriage repaying through gratitude and invisibility. I wore my mother's veil, a detail Patricia found charming enough to mention twice at the rehearsal dinner, in a tone that made clear she considered it a sweet, slightly quaint choice, rather than the deeply meaningful one it actually was to me. Derek cried during his vows, the same real tears I'd later watch him cry over the miscarriage. Tears I now understand were entirely genuine in the moment, and entirely disconnected from any actual, durable commitment to honesty, because I've come to believe Derek was capable of real emotion and real deception simultaneously, in the exact same breath, without apparently experiencing any internal contradiction about it at all. My father walked me down the aisle in a suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion, the nicest one he owned, and I remember catching his eye halfway down that aisle and seeing something that looked, even then, like quiet worry underneath the pride. A worry I dismissed at the time as ordinary father of the bride nerves, and which I now recognize, knowing him as well as I do, as an instinct he'd had about this family from the very beginning that he'd chosen not to voice on my wedding day. Because what father wants to be the one who says something on that particular morning? The morning of the gala, by contrast, getting my hair done at Fatima's small salon in Lincoln Park, I felt something I hadn't felt getting ready for my own wedding, entirely, uncomplicatedly like myself. I'd chosen the emerald dress alone, paid for it with my own card, picked shoes that were comfortable enough to stand in all night, rather than shoes chosen to photograph well next to Patricia's approved color palette. Fatima asked, while pinning the last curl into place, whether I was excited for the big anniversary party, and I told her, honestly, that I was nervous, and she asked what I was nervous about, and I said, I'm about to find out exactly who's going to be standing next to me when something true finally gets said out loud. And she must have heard something in my voice, because she stopped talking about small things and just held my hand for a moment before finishing my hair. The kind of quiet solidarity strangers sometimes offer each other without needing to understand the specifics. Gerald Voss's retirement dinner, which I mentioned briefly, deserves a little more detail because it's one of the few unambiguously warm memories from that entire year. The steakhouse Harold chose was a modest, old-fashioned place in Northbrook that Gerald had been going to since 1987, the kind of restaurant with red leather booths and a maitre d' who still remembered regulars by name. Gerald wore his good suit, the navy one his late wife had picked out for him years earlier, and spent most of the dinner talking not about the fraud or the forged signature, but about the actual decades-long work of managing this family's trust honestly. The college funds he'd carefully grown for grandchildren not yet born when he started. The conservative, patient investment strategy he'd maintained, even when Patricia, years earlier, had pushed for something flashier. "I did this work because I believed in what Harold was building," Gerald told the table, his voice a little unsteady with age and emotion both. "And I never once, in 30 years, imagined someone inside this family would use my own signature as a weapon against it." Harold reached over and put a hand on Gerald's shoulder, and I watched two old men who had built something real together sit with the specific grief of watching that real thing get violated by someone who never had to build anything to begin with. And I understood, watching them, that this case had never really been about money at all, not underneath everything else. It had been about which kind of person gets to keep being trusted, and which kind eventually gets found out. I started seeing someone in April, 6 months ago now, a structural engineer named Marcus Reyes. No relation to Marcus Feld. A coincidence that made both of us laugh the first time it came up. Who I met, of all places, through the Whitfield Structural Group Board, where he consults occasionally on large commercial projects. Marcus is nothing like Derek in almost every measurable way. He drives a 6-year-old Honda he maintains meticulously himself, talks about his actual, verifiable client projects with specific technical detail rather than vague self-mythologizing, and, on our third date, when I told him the broad outline of what had happened in my marriage, he didn't try to comfort me with a grand gesture or a performance of sympathy. He just asked good, specific questions about how the forensic reconciliation actually worked, genuinely curious about the mechanics, and told me afterward that it sounded like the most impressive thing he'd ever heard someone describe about their own life. I'm not rushing anything with Marcus, but I notice, now, in a way I didn't used to let myself notice, whether a person's stated version of their life actually matches the details underneath it, and so far, with Marcus, every detail I've quietly checked has matched exactly what he told me, which I've come to understand is its own small, ordinary kind of miracle. The continuing education seminar I mentioned, the one I now teach twice a year for the Illinois CPA Society, has become something I didn't expect it to become, a genuine second calling layered on top of my regular practice. The first time I taught it, in a windowless conference room at a downtown hotel, to about 40 accountants, most of them mid-career, a few of them clearly there because their firms required continuing education credits rather than out of genuine interest. I walked them through the anonymized architecture of the Meridian case step by step, the $2,000 discrepancy that shouldn't have meant anything, the shell company registered 6 days after a birthday, the mail forwarding address, the signature comparison methodology, the pattern of disbursements disguised as administrative fees. About 20 minutes in, I watched a woman in the third row, maybe 55 years old, go very still and then start taking notes, with a kind of urgency that told me she wasn't hearing a hypothetical case study. She approached me afterward, quietly, and told me she'd noticed something similar in her own elderly mother's finances 8 months earlier, and had talked herself out of investigating it further because it felt disloyal to suspect her own brother, who managed their mother's accounts. I gave her Renata's card. I don't know what happened after that, and I've made peace with not knowing, but I think about her often because she is, I suspect, one of thousands of people quietly living inside exactly the situation I lived inside, telling themselves that loyalty and blindness are the same thing. The trust itself, restructured under Harold's direction with Renata's legal guidance and my own forensic oversight, now operates under a considerably more rigorous set of controls than it did before any of this happened. Dual authorization required for any disbursement over $500, quarterly third-party audits conducted by a firm with no personal relationship to any family member, and a standing independent trustee position. Filled, at Harold's insistence and over Patricia's initial, muted objection, by me, in addition to my board seat, a role I accepted not because I needed the modest annual stipend attached to it, but because I wanted, personally, to be the person standing between that money and anyone who might someday be tempted to treat it the way Derek treated it, as an inheritance he was owed regardless of whether he'd ever actually earned or protected it. Vanessa's day-to-day life at Whitfield Structural Group, 11 months into her entry-level role, has settled into a rhythm that still occasionally surprises people who knew her before, myself included. She reports, according to her direct supervisor, on time, prepares her own project documentation without delegating it to an assistant she doesn't actually have, and recently completed her first full-site inspection report on a mid-sized commercial build in Schaumburg without needing significant revision, a milestone small enough that it would be invisible in almost anyone else's career, and genuinely remarkable in the context of a woman who spent 38 years believing competence was optional as long as your last name opened doors. She has not apologized to me directly in any way I would consider sufficient, and I have not required one, because I've decided her actual, sustained behavior over the last 11 months matters more to me than any speech she might eventually deliver about how sorry she is, and behavior, unlike apology, cannot be performed indefinitely without becoming real. Chip's one-bedroom apartment in Elgin, according to the same mutual family friend who keeps me loosely updated on developments I no longer have direct access to, is furnished almost entirely from a single trip to a big-box furniture store, sparse in a way that apparently makes him a little uncomfortable, accustomed as he was to a guest house decorated, at Patricia's direction, by an actual interior designer. He has, as of 3 months ago, stopped pitching new ventures entirely, a change his project coordinator supervisor apparently finds a relief, since his first 2 months on the job were reportedly spent trying to convince his manager to let him optimize the client onboarding funnel, using techniques from a business podcast rather than simply learning how a construction schedule actually works. I don't know if Chip will ever fully become the kind of person who builds something real rather than borrows the appearance of it. I know that for the first time in his adult life, he no longer has the option of not finding out. I want to be honest about one more thing before I let this story end, because I think honesty is the entire point of everything that happened, and it would be a strange kind of dishonesty to leave it out. I don't feel triumphant, exactly, when I think about all of this now, 14 months later, sitting at my lake house with a glass of wine and a view of water I own outright with my own name on the deed. I feel something quieter than triumph and more durable. I feel like a woman who spent 6 years being told, in 100 small ways, that she was lucky to be tolerated at a table she'd actually built half the wealth sitting on top of, and who finally, patiently, methodically, proved, not to Derek, not to Patricia, not even really to Harold, but to herself, in the one place it actually mattered, that she had never once needed their permission to be exactly as capable, as valuable, and as worthy of a clean, undeniable truth as she'd always quietly known herself to be. Special Agent Denise Okafor interviewed me twice during the formal investigation, both times in a small, unremarkable conference room at the Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road, and I want to describe those interviews because they taught me something about how differently the world treats you when the truth you're carrying is fully documented rather than merely felt. Agent Okafor was in her mid-40s, direct without being cold, the kind of professional who asked precise questions and then actually waited, in silence, for complete answers rather than filling the space the way so many people do out of discomfort. In our first interview, she walked through my spreadsheet reconciliation line by line, asking me to explain my methodology for each entry, and I watched her expression shift, subtly, from polite procedural interest to something closer to genuine professional respect, as she realized the level of rigor I'd applied without any formal law enforcement training. Cross-referencing bank metadata, verifying LLC formation timelines against public records, building a signature comparison protocol from techniques I'd read about in forensic accounting journals, rather than any formal certification. "Miss Marsh," she said toward the end of that first interview, setting down her pen, "in 15 years doing this work, I've had maybe 3 civilian complainants hand me a case file this clean. Most people come to us with suspicion and anger. You came to us with evidence." I told her I'd had 9 months and a very good reason to be thorough. She nodded, and something in that exchange, a federal agent acknowledging, plainly, that my work met a professional standard most trained investigators rarely see from an outsider, landed somewhere in me that 6 years of Patricia's dismissiveness had left hollow, and I felt it fill back in, slowly, over the following months, every time someone treated the facts I'd assembled as exactly what they were, undeniable. The second interview, 3 weeks later, focused more on the personal dimension of the case. My relationship with Derek, the timeline of the affair, whether I'd had any knowledge of or involvement in Meridian Advisory Partners before I discovered the discrepancy. Agent Okafor asked at one point whether I'd ever confronted Derek directly during the 9 months I was building the case, and I told her no, and explained why. Because I understood, from my professional experience with exactly this kind of fraud, that confrontation without complete evidence simply gives the person committing the fraud time and motivation to destroy the paper trail, move funds somewhere untraceable, and construct a story that reframes the confronter as paranoid or vindictive rather than correct. Agent Okafor wrote that answer down carefully, word for word, and later, when Renata reviewed the interview transcript as part of case preparation, she told me that answer alone had done more to establish my credibility with the eventual prosecutors than almost anything else in the file, because it demonstrated exactly the kind of disciplined, methodical thinking that makes a witness difficult for defense counsel to attack. My father drove up from Rockford the weekend after the arrest, sat with me at my kitchen island in the Lincoln Park apartment, the one I kept, the one that had never once had Derek's name on the lease even during the marriage, another quiet instinct I'm grateful I trusted, and asked me, gently, how I was actually doing, underneath the composed version of the story I'd been telling everyone else. I told him the truth, that I felt like two different people occupying the same body, one of them a forensic accountant who had executed a 9-month investigation with total precision and no small measure of professional pride, and the other a 34-year-old woman grieving a marriage, a family she genuinely wanted to belong to, and a version of her own future she'd quietly built around people who had never actually deserved that investment. My father, who has never been a man of many words, sat with that for a long moment and then said, "Alina, your mother and I worried about that family from the first Thanksgiving. We didn't say anything because you seemed happy, and we didn't want to be the kind of parents who make their daughter doubt herself over dinner table manners. But I want you to know we saw it. We saw how small they tried to make you feel. And I have never, in your entire life, been prouder of you than I am watching you refuse to let that be the end of your story." I cried, finally, properly, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, not in front of Patricia, not in front of Derek, not in that ballroom, but at my own kitchen island, in front of the one person who had never once needed me to prove anything to earn his love. I think about the version of myself who stood in Patricia's kitchen 6 years ago holding a serving spoon, absorbing, "Well, isn't that useful?" without a single word of response, and I don't feel embarrassed by her the way I sometimes expected I might, looking back. I feel protective of her. She didn't yet know what she was capable of. She was still operating under the belief, drilled into her by a lifetime of being the outsider in rooms full of inherited confidence, that patience and quiet competence would eventually be enough to earn unconditional belonging. It took her 3 more years, a forged signature, an affair, and $218,400 to learn the harder, truer lesson. Belonging you have to constantly, silently earn from people who call you trash at their own dinner table was never actually belonging at all. It was tolerance, extended conditionally, and tolerance, once you finally see it clearly for what it is, stops being something you're willing to keep paying for with your own dignity. There's a detail from that gala I've circled back to more than almost any other, one I didn't fully process until months afterward, sitting with my father at that same kitchen island. The exact moment right before Harold set down his index cards and began speaking, when I looked at the plate in front of me, seared scallops, mostly untouched, a small pool of beurre blanc going cold at the edge, and thought, with a clarity that surprised me even in the moment, that I would remember this plate for the rest of my life, the way you remember the ordinary objects present at the exact instant your entire world reorganizes itself. I remember the weight of my own fork in my hand, set down deliberately rather than dropped, a small, private echo of every time I had set down cutlery at that family's table, rather than let myself throw it. 6 years of controlled restraint distilled into one final, quiet gesture before the loudest thing that had ever happened in that family happened in front of 600 witnesses. Patricia's champagne glass, when it fell, made a sound I can still hear precisely if I let myself think about it too long. Not a shatter, just a soft, wet thud against carpet, followed by that slow, spreading stain, dark against cream, the exact color of a secret finally becoming visible. I think, too, about the specific texture of the silence that followed Harold's sentence about Brooke Calloway, the particular quality of 600 people simultaneously realizing they were watching something real rather than a scripted anniversary toast. The way sound seemed to physically drain out of that ballroom, the orchestra's abandoned instruments catching gold light from the chandeliers. absolutely still, a visual so precise it felt almost staged even though nothing about it had been. I remember a single champagne flute somewhere behind me clinking softly against a plate as someone set it down too abruptly, the sound unnaturally loud in that silence, and I remember thinking, in that strange, fractured way shock produces clarity in odd places, that I would probably remember that small clink for the rest of my life too. This tiny, meaningless sound that happened to land in the exact second my entire marriage ended in front of witnesses. I want to say something too about Derek's face in that moment because I've thought about it more than I expected to, given everything. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was something closer to a man watching a structure he'd spent years quietly hollowing out finally, audibly, begin to collapse. The specific horror of realizing the performance has run out of runway, with no warning and no chance to prepare a better version of himself for the landing. I don't say this with sympathy exactly. I don't think I have much sympathy left to spend on him, not after everything. But I say it because I think it's important, in a story like this, to be honest that the person who wronged you doesn't stop being a full human being with a recognizable range of emotion the moment they're finally caught. He was frightened. He was, I think, genuinely shocked at how completely the evidence had been assembled. Because I don't believe, even at the very end, that Derek fully understood what I was capable of when I decided to stop being quiet. That underestimation, more than the money, more than Brooke Calloway, is the thing I think about most when I try to understand how 6 years of marriage could exist on top of so little real seeing of who I actually was. Renata told me once, near the end of the legal process, something I've carried with me since. Elena, the reason this case worked as well as it did isn't just that you found good evidence. It's that you never let yourself become the story. You stayed the person presenting facts, even when every single fact was also, simultaneously, the worst thing that had ever happened to you personally. That discipline is rare, and it's the only reason 600 people believed Harold instantly, without a shred of doubt, the moment he opened his mouth. Because everyone in that family already knew, on some level, that you were the one person incapable of making something like this up. I think about that assessment often, because it reframes the entire 9 months not as an act of vengeance, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in it, but as an act of radical, disciplined honesty in a family that had spent decades rewarding exactly the opposite quality in every single person who sat at that table except me. Marcus Feld, the investigator Renata brought in, deserves a fuller telling too, because without his particular expertise, several pieces of this case would have taken far longer to assemble, possibly too long to matter. Marcus had spent 19 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before retiring to start his own consultancy, specializing almost entirely in exactly the kind of shell company reconstruction that cracked open Ryan Callahan's role in Meridian Advisory Partners LLC. He worked out of a modest office above a dry cleaner in Evanston, drove a Subaru held together partly by loyalty, and had the specific, understated confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades proving that money, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it, always leaves a trail, because moving money requires touching systems that keep records, and records, unlike people, don't lie to protect anyone's feelings. Marcus's method for reconstructing Ryan Callahan's finances involved cross-referencing public records most people don't know exist. County property assessments, vehicle lease filings, professional licensing databases, court records from an old minor civil dispute Ryan had once been party to over a security deposit, building, piece by piece, a financial profile detailed enough to demonstrate that Ryan's lifestyle didn't match any legitimate business he could point to, which made his role as Meridian's manager almost impossible to explain innocently once laid out in full. The Bayview Charters investigation, which ultimately produced the most damning single piece of evidence in the entire case, the direct date match between Derek's charter bookings and his claimed business travel, came together through a public records request Marcus filed with the Marina's Business Licensing Authority in California, requesting booking logs under a provision most people don't realize exists for businesses operating under certain municipal permits near public waterways. It took 6 weeks for the request to be processed, 6 weeks during which I lived with the specific, grinding anxiety of not knowing whether the paper trail would hold or whether some detail would come back inconclusive, forcing me to abandon months of work. When the records finally arrived, confirming all 6 dates precisely, I remember sitting in Renata's office, reading them with Marcus present, and feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even relief, exactly, but a strange, hollow steadiness, The particular calm that comes from finally holding proof of something you already knew was true, but had spent months being told, quietly, by your own instincts, that maybe you were imagining. I drove past the Lake Forest estate once, about 4 months after the gala, not planning to stop, just passing through the neighborhood on my way to a different meeting, and found myself slowing the car in front of the wrought iron gate I'd driven through 100 times over 6 years, looking at the guest house set back near the tree line where Chip used to live rent-free, at the main house's tall windows catching afternoon light the way they always had, at the circular driveway where Patricia used to greet arriving guests with an air kiss and an inventory of their outfit. Nothing about the house looked different. That struck me as strange at the time, that a place capable of generating so much quiet cruelty, so much theft, so much careful deception, could sit there in the September light looking exactly, architecturally, the same as it always had, as though buildings don't know or care what happens inside them, as though only the people do. I did not stop the car. I did not feel the urge to go inside, to confront anyone, to relive anything. I simply looked at it for maybe 45 seconds. The way you might look at an old photograph of yourself in an outfit you can't believe you once thought looked good. And then I drove on to my meeting, and I did not think about that house again for several weeks, which felt, at the time, like its own small, private kind of victory. Harold told me, in one of our Sunday calls, that he'd considered selling the estate entirely, starting fresh somewhere smaller, somewhere without 40 years of complicated history embedded in every room, but ultimately decided against it, for a reason that surprised me when he explained it. I built that house with the same hands that built the company, Elena. I'm not going to let what Derek did convince me the things I built are tainted. I'm going to make sure what happens inside that house from now on is worth the walls it's happening in. I understood that instinct better than I expected to, because I'd made a version of the same choice myself, keeping the Lincoln Park apartment rather than fleeing to some entirely new neighborhood untouched by memory, choosing instead to simply change what happened inside the same rooms. New furniture eventually, new routines immediately, the same address holding a completely different life than the one it had held 18 months earlier. I've been asked, a handful of times now, by people who've heard some version of this story secondhand, whether I regret waiting 9 months instead of confronting Derek the moment I found that first $2,000 discrepancy, whether all that patience was worth the additional months of living inside a lie I already suspected. I understand the question, but I think it misunderstands something fundamental about how deception like this actually works inside a family that has spent generations perfecting plausible deniability. If I had confronted Derek in February, with nothing but a suspicious spreadsheet entry, I know exactly how that conversation would have gone, because I watched this family manage smaller crises for 6 years and learned their playbook by heart. Derek would have expressed wounded confusion, framed my suspicion as evidence of my own insecurity or overwork, possibly cried the same genuine-seeming tears he'd cried at our wedding and after the miscarriage, and within a week, Meridian Advisory Partners LLC would have been dissolved. The funds moved somewhere untraceable. Ryan Callahan warned to say nothing, and Brooke Calloway's payments rerouted through some new mechanism I'd never have found. Patricia would have called me paranoid, possibly cruel, for accusing her golden son of something so serious without proof. I would have spent the rest of my marriage, however much longer it lasted, being quietly recast as the unstable wife who'd once made a wild accusation, a reputation that would have followed me through every future family gathering, regardless of how untrue it actually was. Patience wasn't passivity. Patience was the only strategy available to someone who understood, professionally and personally, that partial evidence against a practiced liar simply hands him time to become a better one. I think about the version of this story where I never noticed the $2,000 discrepancy at all, where I stayed exactly as blind as this family needed me to be, and it frightens me more than almost anything else connected to this whole ordeal. If I hadn't been trained, professionally, to notice numbers that don't add up, if I hadn't spent a decade building the specific muscle of refusing to look away from an uncomfortable pattern, I might still be at that table today, still absorbing Patricia's small cruelties, still believing Derek's late nights were quarterly projections, still watching the trust bleed out $218,000 with no idea any of it was happening. Right up until the moment there was nothing left to steal and Derek moved on to whatever came after that, possibly with Brooke, possibly with someone else entirely, leaving me to eventually discover the wreckage with none of the careful evidence I'd need to prove any of it, none of Renata's expertise already lined up, none of Harold's trust already earned through years of quiet loyalty he'd have no reason yet to extend me. I got lucky in exactly one specific, narrow way. My professional training happened to overlap precisely with the exact kind of crime being committed against me. Most people aren't that lucky. Most people have to trust their instincts without a spreadsheet to back them up. And I think, more than anything else this experience taught me, it taught me to take other people's quiet instincts about their own families far more seriously than I once might have. Because I know now, firsthand, exactly how long a well-practiced liar can keep even a trained observer doubting her own eyes. Gerald Voss came to visit me at my Lincoln Park apartment once, about 2 months after his retirement dinner. Unannounced, standing at my door with a small potted orchid and an expression of careful formality that told me this visit meant something to him beyond simple friendliness. He sat at my kitchen island, the same one where my father had told me he was proud of me, and told me that he'd spent 30 years managing that family's trust with a specific private fear he'd never voiced to anyone. That someday, someone in that family would take advantage of his trust in a way he wouldn't be sharp enough anymore to catch. And that fear had haunted him particularly in the last 5 years, as he'd felt his own memory beginning to soften around the edges in small, ordinary ways that come with age. I used to lie awake some nights, he told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on the counter, wondering if I was the weak link, if someday I'd sign something I shouldn't without noticing, and it would be my fault, my carelessness, that let something terrible happen to that family's money. He looked at me and said, "You proved I wasn't careless, Elena. Someone stole from me specifically because I trusted them, not because I made a mistake. I don't know how to thank you for that, because you didn't just protect Harold's trust. You protected the last thing I had left that I was still proud of, my own name." I didn't have a response prepared for that. I just reached across the counter and held his hand for a moment, two people who had both, in our own ways, spent decades being quietly underestimated by people who never bothered to check their assumptions against actual evidence. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that settles into you after a fight like this one ends, one nobody warns you about when they're admiring the outcome from the outside. For the first 2 months after the gala, I found myself unable to fully relax even in moments that should have felt like relief. A Sunday afternoon with nothing scheduled, a quiet dinner alone, a weekend at the lake house before I'd even fully moved in. My body had spent 9 months braced for discovery, for the possibility that Derek might notice something, that Patricia might sense the case building underneath her son's charm, that some detail might unravel before I was ready, and that bracing didn't simply switch off the moment the truth became public. I started seeing a therapist myself that October, a decision I resisted for longer than I probably should have. Some old instinct telling me that needing help was its own kind of admission, that the ordeal had cost me more than my composed public account suggested. My therapist, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Priya Suresh, asked me in our second session what it had felt like to spend 9 months building a case against my own husband while maintaining a completely normal public appearance at every family gathering, and I told her, honestly, that it had felt like living with a second, silent job that only I knew existed, one with stakes higher than anything in my actual career, conducted entirely in the hours between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. She told me that kind of sustained, hidden vigilance produces its own particular form of exhaustion, distinct from grief, distinct from anger, something closer to the fatigue of a soldier who has finally been allowed to put down a weapon they'd been carrying for so long, their arm had forgotten what it felt like to hang naturally at their side. That description landed somewhere true in me, and I've held on to it since, on the days when the exhaustion still surfaces unexpectedly, usually triggered by something small. A shell company mentioned in an unrelated case file at work. A woman at a dinner party describing her mother-in-law's coldness with a laugh that doesn't quite reach her eyes. A flash of Sausalito's particular gold evening light in a photograph that has nothing to do with my own life at all. I've thought a great deal, too, about what it means that Harold, of all people, turned out to be the ally I needed, given how completely I'd underestimated him for the first several years of my marriage. I had, if I'm honest, spent most of those early years assuming Harold's quietness meant he was simply a passive presence in that family, content to let Patricia run the social machinery while he focused on the company, a kind, distant figure, rather than someone capable of the kind of decisive, public reckoning he delivered at that podium. I think about how many people in my life I've probably misjudged in exactly that same way, assuming quietness means weakness, assuming someone who doesn't perform their values loudly at every dinner doesn't actually hold values worth trusting. Harold taught me, without ever intending to teach me anything, that some of the most reliable people are the ones who spend years simply watching, quietly building their own private ledger of who deserves loyalty and who's been spending it carelessly, until the moment finally arrives when spending that stored-up clarity all at once, publicly, becomes not just possible but necessary. I don't think Harold set out to be my ally the way Renata did, professionally, deliberately. I think Harold became my ally the way honest people often become allies to each other, not through grand declaration, but through 6 years of small, accumulated observations about who was actually telling him the truth, culminating in a single conversation at a diner in Northbrook, where he finally decided that observation was worth acting on. The lake house, now that I've lived in it through one full season, has become the place where I do most of my actual thinking. The way some people process life through exercise or journaling. I do mine sitting on a small dock at dawn, coffee going lukewarm beside me, watching mist come up off water that belongs to no one's approval but my own. I think some mornings about the 11-year-old version of myself, growing up in Rockford, watching my father come home exhausted from 12-hour shifts, learning early that money was something you earned through unglamorous, patient labor, rather than something that simply arrived because of who your family happened to be. I think that early lesson, more than any accounting certification I ever earned, is what actually made this entire investigation possible. Not the technical skill alone, though that mattered enormously, but the deeper, inherited instinct that nothing real gets built by pretending, that every genuine thing worth having requires the unglamorous, patient work of actually doing it. Whether that's building a construction company from 11 men and a truck, or building a case against your own husband one verified transaction at a time. I want to close this out with one final memory, one I haven't shared with anyone outside my father and Dr. Suresh, because I think it's the truest, smallest version of everything this whole ordeal actually taught me. About 6 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday evening, I was standing in my own kitchen in the Lincoln Park apartment, alone, cooking dinner just for myself for probably the 100th time since the divorce filing. Something simple, pasta with whatever vegetables I had left in the refrigerator, and I caught my own reflection in the dark window over the sink. And for one strange, suspended moment, I saw the exact posture I used to hold at every Whitfield family dinner. Shoulders slightly braced, chin angled just enough to look pleasant without inviting scrutiny. The specific physical vigilance of a woman who has spent years making herself small and careful in rooms that never once extended her the same courtesy. And then, watching my own reflection, I felt my shoulders drop, on their own, without any conscious decision, the way tension releases from a muscle you didn't fully realize you'd been clenching, and I understood, standing there over a pot of boiling water in an empty kitchen that belonged entirely to me, that this exact unremarkable moment, cooking dinner with nobody watching, nobody grading my outfit or my last name or my little job downtown, was the actual finish line I'd been working toward for 9 months. More than the gala, more than the sentencing hearing, more than any single dramatic confrontation. Not vindication in front of 600 witnesses, though that mattered. Just this. A kitchen where I could finally stand exactly as I was, unguarded, unbraced, entirely myself, with no one left in the room who needed me to be smaller than I actually am. I think about Patricia sometimes, in that same quiet, unguarded way, and I find myself hoping, despite everything, that she eventually reaches a version of that same unclenching, whatever that would look like for a woman who spent 40 years believing her value depended entirely on how flawless her family appeared from the outside. I don't know if she will. Harold tells me the therapy is slow, halting, full of the particular resistance people build over decades of practice performance. But real, he insists, in a way it wasn't in the early weeks when she was mostly just frightened of losing her social standing, rather than genuinely examining what she'd done. I've decided I can hold space for the possibility of her eventual growth without requiring it, without waiting for it, without letting my own peace depend one bit on whether she ever gets there. That, I think, might be the final lesson underneath all the others. You can want good things for the people who hurt you, distantly, generously, and still build a life that has absolutely nothing left in it waiting on their permission, their apology, or their change. So that's the story, or at least the true shape of it. The version underneath the version people whisper about at Chicago networking events without knowing all the names attached to it. A $2,000 discrepancy. 9 months of spreadsheets built between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. A forged signature belonging to a 78-year-old man who never did anything wrong. A shell company registered 6 days after a birthday. A woman named Brooke Calloway, who I have chosen, deliberately, not to think about anymore. A father-in-law who finally, after 6 years, decided that keeping the peace mattered less than telling 600 people the truth. A mother-in-law who dropped a champagne glass and has not, in 14 months, found a single word to say to me that resembles an apology. And a version of myself, standing at a kitchen sink on an ordinary Tuesday, finally, fully unclenched. People keep asking me, in comments on other stories like this one, what actually happens to the money after a restitution order like Derek's gets entered, because it's the detail that seems to matter most to strangers trying to picture the ending clearly. So let me be precise about it, since precision is the entire habit that got me through this. Federal restitution orders don't simply appear as a lump sum. They're enforced through a structured payment plan overseen by the Bureau of Prisons and after release by federal probation, garnished first from any prison labor wages, which are modest, typically a few dollars a day, and then, far more significantly, from future earnings once Derek is released and working again, at a percentage determined by his post-release income and living expenses, with the trust itself entitled to pursue civil collection on any remaining balance for years afterward if necessary. Between the liquidated assets, the BMW, the watch collection, the brokerage account, roughly $153,000 of the $218,400 was recovered within the first year alone, a faster recovery than Renata had initially projected, and the remaining balance sits on a payment schedule extending, realistically, another 6 to 8 years past his release date. Harold restructured the trust's growth projections to absorb that gap without shorting his actual grandchildren's education funds, quietly moving some of his own personal assets to cover the shortfall in the near term. A decision he described to me simply as, "That money was always meant to protect this family." I'm not going to let Derek's theft be the reason it fails to do that job just because collection takes longer than we'd like. I think, in the end, about what I'd say to someone sitting exactly where I was sitting 3 years ago, noticing a discrepancy they don't yet want to look at too closely, still telling themselves the story where their family loves them exactly as much as they've always assumed. I'd tell them, trust the number. Not the story someone tells you about the number, not the tone of voice that makes questioning it feel disloyal or paranoid, not the tears that might follow when you finally ask, just the number itself and what it actually factually represents. Numbers, unlike people, have never once lied to me. Every single person in that ballroom the night everything came apart had, at some point over 6 years, told me a version of events designed to keep me comfortable, quiet, and looking somewhere other than where the truth actually lived. The spreadsheet never did that. The spreadsheet simply waited, patiently, for me to be ready to see it clearly. The same way I hope, now, that anyone listening to this who recognizes some version of their own life in mine finds the courage to open whatever drawer they've been too afraid to open. Because I promise you, whatever's inside it is more survivable than the exhausting, permanent work of pretending you never noticed it was there. There's a photograph Harold gave me last month, one I didn't know existed until he pulled it out of an old folder during a Sunday call turned into an unplanned visit. A picture from that very first Thanksgiving, 6 years ago, before Patricia's comment about my father. Before any of it, just me standing near the kitchen island in a green sweater I'd forgotten I owned, laughing at something off camera, 28 years old, and still fully unaware of what this family would eventually cost me, and what I would eventually cost them in return. Harold said he'd found it while cleaning out an old drawer during the renovation he's finally doing on the study, and something about it had made him want me to have it. So you remember, he said, that the woman in that photo was never actually the small, tolerated version of herself. Patricia tried to make her believe she was. She was always this. It just took the rest of us too long to see it clearly. I keep that photograph on the small shelf above my desk at the lake house now, next to a framed copy of my CPA license and a chipped mug my father gave me the Christmas I made partner. 3 unremarkable objects that, together, tell the only version of this story that actually matters to me anymore. Not the gala, not the champagne glass, not even the sentencing hearing, but the plain, durable fact of a woman who kept paying attention, kept doing the unglamorous work nobody was watching, and came out the other side of it exactly, finally, undeniably herself. Renata called me last week, actually, with something that felt like a fitting coda to all of it. A new client, a woman in her early 40s, a dentist married into a family that owns a chain of regional car dealerships, sitting across from Renata's desk with a spreadsheet of her own, describing a pattern of discrepancies in a family trust that sounded, in Renata's careful description, almost eerily familiar in its shape if not its specific details. Renata asked if I'd be willing to consult on the forensic side, informally, As someone who understood both the technical reconstruction and the particular emotional terrain of building a case against people who are supposed to love you, I said yes before she finished the question. I've since spent 3 evenings with this woman, whose name I won't share here out of respect for a story that isn't mine to tell yet, walking her through exactly the kind of methodical, patient documentation that got me through my own 9 months, and watching her posture change, gradually, meeting by meeting, from someone apologizing for her own suspicion into someone standing fully behind her own evidence. I don't know yet how her story ends. I know that mine didn't end with a champagne glass hitting carpet, no matter how satisfying that moment was to live through. It ended, quietly, months later, at a kitchen sink, with my shoulders finally dropping on their own, and I suspect hers will end somewhere just as unremarkable and just as real, whenever she's finally ready to stop bracing. I still have the external hard drive, the original one, the first place all of this ever lived outside my own head, sitting now in a small fireproof safe at the lake house rather than a locked filing cabinet at my office, because I don't need to hide it from anyone anymore. I open the folder sometimes, not out of any lingering need to relitigate the case in my own mind, but almost the way you might reread an old journal from a difficult year, to remember exactly how far the distance runs between the woman who built that first Meridian Reconciliation tab at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, uncertain and afraid of what she might find, and the woman sitting on a dock at dawn now, coffee going lukewarm, entirely certain of everything she is. And I think if there's one image I'd want to leave you with tonight, it isn't the ballroom or the champagne glass or even the sentencing hearing. It's that Tuesday night 3 years ago, a woman alone in a bathroom with a phone in her hand and a $2,000 discrepancy she could have easily explained away, choosing instead, quietly, with no audience and no promise of vindication, to open a spreadsheet and simply refuse to look away. Everything that came after, the FBI, the gala, the sentencing, the lake house, the life I finally built on my own name, started in that one small, unglamorous decision nobody was there to witness or applaud. That's the part I actually want you to remember. 3 weeks after the sentencing hearing, going through a box of old files I'd never bothered to open, I found something that had nothing to do with Derek at all. A folder with Vanessa's name on it, dated years before any of this began, sitting in a drawer of documents Harold's own attorney had handed over during discovery, and the moment I opened it, I understood this story wasn't actually finished the way I'd let myself believe it was. If you've ever thought you'd closed a chapter only to find one more page waiting inside it, comment below, because that folder is where the next part of this begins, and you're going to want to be subscribed for it, because I promise you, what's inside changes everything you think you already know about this family.